Welcome back to the Sleepy Gamer channel. There is a certain kind of quiet that only appears in a dim bedroom, long after the day has finished arguing with itself. The lights are low, the curtains barely holding back the night, and somewhere, on a pillow or a blanket, there is that small, familiar rectangle of plastic, the old gray Game Boy, resting in your hands like a tiny, self-contained world. Then the screen wakes up, the red power light blinks on, and Pokémon Red's title chime spills out, thin and tinny, but somehow gentle enough to feel like a lullaby played through a toy piano. The glow is soft, a pale greenish window in the dark, and the pixelated Charizard on the title screen flickers with the kind of confidence you probably didn't have as a child trying to keep your eyes open just a little longer. For every mighty legendary that would come later, with orchestral themes and swirling animations, there is this simple, looping melody, repeating over and over until it stops feeling like a call to adventure and starts to sound like something you could fall asleep to. This is not a story of glory or victory, not tonight. Instead, settle in, close your eyes, and let this become a quiet walk through Kanto. A slow drift through facts, secrets, and tiny design choices from Pokémon Red, told at the pace of a drowsy late-night play session. The screen doesn't need your full attention. In fact, it is perfectly fine if you never look at it at all. What makes Pokémon Red so interesting is how much it can still offer as sound alone. The soft clicks of menu beeps, the looping 8-bit music, and the faint suggestion of footsteps as your character moves from tile to tile. Even if you only imagine them drifting in the current of memory, Kanto itself sits inside that gray cartridge like a snow globe. Someone shook in 1996 and never quite put down again. There is no in-game clock here, no day or night, just a timeless afternoon where Pallet Town's theme always plays at the same gentle tempo. The sprites are simple, sometimes a little awkward, and yet, placed together, these rough outlines and shared cries become a whole region, with roots and caves and cities that unfold at a gentle pace, perfect for listening as you drift toward sleep. Some Pokémon even share the same cry with only a slight pitch change, as if the game is quietly reusing lullabies to save space. Most discussions of this game focus on battles, on optimal teams, on whether choosing Charmander and walking helpless into Brock and Misty was a bold move or a frustrating mistake. Here, the energy is different. There will be no loud jump cuts, no sudden shouts when a rare encounter appears. No triumphant music sting when the Hall of Fame screen finally scrolls by. Just a steady stream of facts, from the first chime of the title screen to the last quiet entry in the Pokédex, inviting you to let your thoughts wander and your eyes grow heavy, while Kanto keeps going endlessly inside that tiny glowing window. And in that tiny glowing window, the story that most people remember isn't quite the one that first existed. In Japan, back in 1996, trainers met this world as Pokémon Red and Green, a slightly rougher, stranger pair of cartridges where sprites were a little more jagged, balance was a little more uneven, and Kanto still felt like an experiment that somehow worked. For every smooth, polished memory you have of the game, there is an earlier, less refined version hiding just out of sight. When those games finally washed up on Western shores, they had already evolved. Green quietly slipped away, and in its place, Pokémon Blue arrived, bringing redrawn sprites, adjusted encounter rates, and small balance tweaks that gently reshaped the adventure without changing its heart. What makes Pokémon Red so interesting is that the name stayed the same, but the world inside the cartridge did not. A Japanese Red player and an English Red player share a title screen, but not quite the same Kanto. Placed together, these twin versions feel almost identical at first glance. You still leave Pallet Town, or you still pick a starter, and you still bump into that first Pidgey or Rattata in the tall grass, those weak little creatures that seem designed to lose early battles and teach you how helpless Level 3 really is. And yet, the details drift apart in quiet ways. Ekans and Arbok slither only through red, while Sandshrew curls up only in blue. One cartridge leans toward fiery, poisonous encounters, the other toward earthy, defensive ones, like two sides of the same coin tucked into a Game Boy slot. Even the sprites tell slightly different stories. In the Japanese red and green, some Pokémon look oddly fierce or off-model, with proportions that feel more like sketchbook concepts than final designs. While the international red and blue smooth them out, rounding edges, softening faces, and quietly deciding how these creatures would live in players' imaginations for decades. The power behind a move doesn't change, but the way a Pokémon stares back from that tiny screen can. And it's surprising how much that alters the mood of a battle. It's easy to think you know Pokémon Red completely, to feel that every route is memorized, every gym leader's team predictable, every cry from the Game Boy speaker a familiar chirp. But this is not a story of glory or victory. It's a gentle walk through the seams and stitches of a game that had to fit on a tiny cartridge, where every reused cry, every shared animation frame, every oddly placed NPC exists because of some little limitation or quiet decision. Settle in, close your eyes, and imagine them drifting in the current. The routes, the towns, the caves, all those 8-bit spaces you've crossed 100 times, still hiding tucked away facts in their corners. Behind each patch of grass, there's an encounter table chosen to make some Pokémon common, and others almost mythic. Behind each line of dialogue, a developer trying to squeeze personality into a handful of characters. As the Game Boy's speaker hums that first title screen chime, we'll move forward from the very beginning of Red's world, one calm fact at a time, letting Kanto unfold slowly, as if you were seeing it again in half-sleep, from the moment you stand in your bedroom to the edge of the first tall grass. From that quiet bedroom floor, the screen in your hands flickers, and Pokémon Red exhales its first breath. A white flash, a brief Nintendo logo, and then that familiar red-tinted title, in simple and bold against the pale Game Boy background. The cartridge doesn't do anything fancy when it boots. There's no elaborate animation, no sweeping cutscene, just a compact little program, jumping straight from startup to that logo, because there was barely enough memory for the adventure itself, let alone a grand introduction. On that title screen, the word Pokémon sits heavy and confident, while the red version tag and the faint copyright line feel almost apologetically small, like they know the real draw is the static trainer and the creature beside him. The hero stands there in a frozen pose, cap tilted, jacket hanging stiffly, while a lone Pokémon cycles in over different versions. Sometimes a squat, slightly awkward Gengar, sometimes a blocky Nidorino, each sprite made of just a few precious tiles. What makes this so interesting is how much personality they squeeze into those jagged outlines, forced by memory limits, to choose every pixel with care. The music loops in a tight circle, a handful of channels humming through the Game Boy's tiny speaker. Bright but a little tinny, like a lullaby that forgot to be gentle. It repeats quickly because it has to. Longer melodies would cost space that needed to be saved for roots, battles, and cries. And yet, that short loop becomes a kind of mantra, something you can let wash over you as you settle in, close your eyes, and let the screen glow faintly in a dark room, more nightlight than console. If you leave it alone, if you resist pressing start, the game quietly decides to move without you. The title fades and a demo battle begins, showing a trainer sending out a Pokémon. You aren't choosing moves, trading weak little blows. There's no tutorial speech bubble, no hand-holding, just a silent demonstration that says, "This is how a turn-based battle works," without using a single extra line of text. For every flashy modern tutorial, there is this wordless little skit, looping forever for the patient and the sleepy. Sometimes that demo is almost unintentionally funny. Two low-level creatures trading tackles and scratches, whittling each other down in the slowest, most helpless struggle imaginable, as if the game is teaching you not just how to fight, but how long you might be staring at that health bar. Placed together, these tiny choices feel like a quiet confidence, a belief that trainers would learn simply by watching. Many players never made it that far, though. They let the title screen glow on a bedside table, the music looping, the pixels barely shifting, until their eyes closed and the Game Boy's red power light became the last star in the room. This is not a story of glory or victory. It's a story of waiting at the threshold, hovering on the edge of adventure, sometimes drifting off before the journey even begins. And just beyond that start button, past the frozen trainer and his patient partner, lies another small decision point that shapes everything. The act of choosing a name, for yourself and for a rival who will follow you everywhere. Those few characters, and the limits behind them, hide more quiet design choices than they first appear to. And in the next step, we'll watch how something as simple as a name begins to define the entire world you're about to enter. From that choice of a patient partner, the game drifts you into something even quieter. A blinking cursor, a grid of letters, and the soft invitation to decide who you are in just 8 characters. Settle in, close your eyes, and you can almost hear the tiny Game Boy speaker humming in the background as the naming screen waits, still and patient, for a word that will follow you through every battle. What makes this moment so interesting is how small it looks and how technical it really is. Pokémon Red is working inside a very tight space, and every name has to live in that space as efficiently as possible. The game stores text as little numeric codes, pulling them from a shared table so it doesn't waste memory repeating the same letters. 8 characters for the player, 8 for the rival, 8 for each Pokémon. Short enough to keep save files tiny, long enough to feel like a real name instead of a random code. For every grand title you might imagine, there is a hard, invisible limit, quietly saying, "That's enough." The game doesn't leave you alone with that cursor either. It gently offers a few default names like Red or Ash for the player, and Blue or Gary for the rival. Little hints that there might be a correct story running underneath your own. This is not a story of glory or victory being forced on you. Instead, it's a soft suggestion, a nudge toward a canon while still letting trainers erase it and write themselves in. Some players keep Red, becoming the silent hero the box art seems to promise. Others tap out their own nickname, or something helpless and silly, and the whole adventure shifts tone with that one decision. The act of entering that name is slow, almost ritualistic. You move across the grid with the D-pad, one gentle click at a time, selecting each letter, watching it appear in the little box at the top. It's not efficient. It's not fast. And yet, that slowness gives you a brief, meditative pause before the journey begins. A moment where the only thing that exists is you. A blinking cursor, and the idea of who this small sprite on the screen is supposed to be. Then the game asks you to do it again, but for someone who will never leave you alone. The rival's name seems like a joke at first, something to poke fun at this cocky creature who always runs one step ahead. Call him Blue, call him Gary, call him something frustrating and petty. Whatever you choose, those 8 characters will echo through menus, dialogue boxes, and battle screens. His name pops up when he challenges you, when he wins, when he loses, when the professor mentions his talent. Placed together, these little reminders turn a simple text field into a constant emotional nudge, making every encounter feel just a bit more personal than the numbers and sprites underneath. Once those 2 names are carved into the save file, your identity is fixed, at least in the game's memory. The screen fades, the music shifts, and suddenly you're standing in a tiny bedroom in Pallet Town, where even the television, the PC, and the simple walls around you hold more quiet details than they first suggest, waiting to be noticed as you take your first careful steps outside. You take those first careful steps, and Pallet Town opens up like a whispered secret, not a grand stage. 2 neat rows of houses, Professor Oak's lab tucked politely at the southern edge, and beyond that, the thin strip of Route 1, like a dark shoreline of tall grass you're not quite meant to touch yet. There is no Pokémon sign glowing in the night, no gym looming with promises of battle and power, no bustling crowd of trainers rushing past. Just your home, your rival's home, the lab, and that single exit. What makes Pallet Town so interesting is how little of it there actually is, and how that absence becomes its own kind of gentle tutorial, quietly telling you that the world is bigger than this, but you don't have to rush into it. Settle in, close your eyes, and you can almost hear the soft crunch of those first hesitant footsteps on the dirt. Game Freak could have started the adventure in a city like Saffron or Celadon, a maze of doors, items, and decisions, but they didn't. Instead, they chose a town so small it barely feels like a town at all. For every sprawling metropolis later in the series, there is this single cluster of roofs, a place where you can't even buy Pokeballs yet. So the game physically prevents you from overthinking your options. This is not a story of glory or victory in its opening minutes. It is a story of learning which button opens the menu, which door leads outside, and how it feels to be weak and unarmed. In a world that only hints at danger, the NPCs here don't lecture, they murmur. Your rival's sister mentions the town map. Oak warns you about stepping into tall grass without a Pokémon, and the wandering aide near the lab hints that the professor's research somehow depends on creatures you haven't even seen. Instead of a glowing arrow or a pop-up tutorial, you get these soft, and almost parental warnings. Don't go into the grass. Not yet. You're helpless out there. And yet, the moment you tried to ignore them and walk north, the scripted encounter with Oak himself catches you, like a teacher pulling you gently back from the edge of the pool. Listen to the music here, looping in the background. It's simple, almost bare, a small melody that doesn't swell or threaten, and after enough late-night restarts, it becomes the sound of safety itself. No battle drums, no urgent rival theme, just that calm tune, placed together. These few repeating notes and those tiny houses, forming a kind of digital lullaby that still lingers in the minds of tired trainers decades later. From this quiet shore, though, the first real choice waits just below the surface. Inside Oak's lab, 3 starters sit on the table, where each one promising a different path, and each one slightly, deliberately unfair. Charmander struggles against the first gyms. Bulbasaur glides through them. Squirtle sits comfortably in between. For every smooth early game, there is a rough one. And the game watches which kind of frustration you're willing to endure. Imagine them drifting in the current, those three little sprites, while you hover over each Pokeball, knowing that this gentle town will soon be behind you, and that your sleepy, quiet beginning is about to evolve into something far less forgiving. And waiting inside those Pokeballs are three tiny case studies in how unfairness can be quietly instructive. Bulbasaur, Charmander, and Squirtle look like equal choices. Three cute little creatures lined up politely, each promising the same gentle start, the same sleepy stroll through Route 1. Settle in, close your eyes, and remember how confident that first decision feels, how simple it seems before the game reveals that these paths are not equal at all. What makes this trio so interesting is that Pokémon Red does not pretend otherwise. For every smooth early game, there is a rough one, and Charmander is very deliberately handed the rough one. Brock waits in Pewter City with rock-type Pokémon that shrug off Ember, and those sturdy Geodude and Onix turn a proud little fire lizard into a helpless scratcher, chipping away for what feels like forever. Squirtle and Bulbasaur, meanwhile, glide through. Water Gun and Vine Whip cut through that gym like it is made of paper, rewarding the trainers who unknowingly picked the right answer. Then, just as the player recovers, Cerulean City offers Misty and another quiet lesson. Her Staryu and Starmie are water types with strong special power. And again, Squirtle and Bulbasaur feel like they were built for this test, while Charmander feels like it wandered into the wrong exam room. 2 gyms in a row, 2 hard counters to fire. And yet, the game never apologizes, never steps in to correct the imbalance. This is not a story of glory or victory. It is a story of slow adjustment. Placed together, these early hurdles are the designer's way of nudging the player's hand. A child who tried to march into every battle with only their starter quickly discovers that Charmander alone is not enough. That relying on one weak creature can be genuinely frustrating. So the tall grass becomes an invitation rather than background decoration. And suddenly, Pidgey, Nidoran, Mankey, and even a humble Caterpie feel less like filler and more like necessary companions, tiny answers to specific problems. In this way, Charmander teaches team building by suffering. That first Geodude that only falls because a borrowed Butterfree uses confusion, that Onix that finally faints after a desperate string of tackles from a Rattata. Those are small, sleepy victories that belong more to the team than to the starter. And yet, as experience points trickle in, Charmander evolves into Charmeleon. Its stats climb, its moves improve, and one day, it spreads wings as Charizard, retroactively justifying every awkward early step. There is a quiet satisfaction in looking back from that moment. The creature that once scratched hopelessly at rocks now soars over Kanto, trivializing the very roots that once stalled it, conturning former walls into scenery. For every early weakness, there is a late reward, and Red repeats this pattern everywhere. Pokémon that seem useless until they learn one key move, routes that appear empty until a hidden item glints in the code, odd corners of caves that exist only for a single secret encounter. Imagine them drifting in the current, these tiny imbalances and quiet payoffs as we move deeper into Kanto's map and watch how that same design philosophy shapes entire towns, caves, and stories you might have run past without ever really seeing. As we move deeper into that map, something subtle settles over Kanto. Like a gentle filter, you don't quite notice at first. Settle in, close your eyes, and think about it. No matter how long you wander in Pokémon Red, the sky never changes, the light never fades, and the world never admits that time is passing at all. Unlike later journeys, there is no internal clock ticking quietly in the background, no day-night cycle shifting the colors of the world. No morning exclusive birds or midnight-only ghosts waiting for patient trainers. Gold and silver would bring time-based evolutions, daily events, and a region that actually woke up and went to sleep. But in red, Kanto exists in a kind of eternal afternoon, a soft, unblinking glow that never quite becomes sunset and never brightens into morning. It is always now, even if you've been playing for hours. What makes this so interesting is that it began as a simple technical limitation, a concession to the Game Boy's tiny cartridge and modest power, and yet, it ends up shaping the entire mood of the adventure. With no clock to track, the game doesn't need to store the current time, schedule events, or remember what happened yesterday. So the save file can remain lean and focused, just enough to record your party, your badges, your items, and the state of a few important flags. It is a world designed to be small and efficient, and somehow that makes it feel strangely endless. There are no time-dependent encounters in tall grass here, no weak, morning-only creature to chase, no frustrating late-night fishing requirement that sends you staring at a real-world clock. The Pokémon you meet are the Pokémon you meet, whether you're playing under the covers at midnight or in the backseat of a car on a bright afternoon. For every elaborate daily lottery or rematch system that would come later, there is Red's simpler rhythm: walk, battle, heal, save. The loop never changes, and because of that, it becomes almost meditative. After a while, your own memories start to blur in the same way the in-game sky does. Late-night sessions feel the same as early morning ones, and a quick half hour before school can blend perfectly into a long, drowsy weekend marathon. This is not a story of glory or victory, so much as it is a story of repetition, of quiet progress, of the same battle animations, and the same cries playing again and again until they dissolve into a single, hazy adventure. Imagine them drifting in the current, these moments of effort and boredom and tiny triumph, all washed in the same unchanging light, placed together. These choices and constraints create a Kanto that feels outside of time, a region that only moves when you do, and pauses obediently whenever you close the lid. And yet, even without hours or days, that little cartridge still had to squeeze an entire region, 151 different Pokémon, and more hidden secrets than most players ever saw into a shockingly small space. And the ways it managed that are stranger and cleverer than they first appear. All of that weight had to sit inside a tiny gray cartridge, and for Pokémon Red, that meant working with a footprint that, by modern standards, feels almost helplessly small. Just a single megabyte or so to hold an entire region, every tile of grass and water, every line of dialogue, every battle calculation, and all 151 creatures pressed together like a crowded PC box. Settle in, close your eyes, and imagine trying to fit an entire childhood into a single, carefully labeled folder. What makes this so interesting is how many quiet compromises are hiding under the surface. Those iconic cries, for example, sound like unique voices when you are young. Little digital roars and squeaks that give each Pokémon its own personality. And yet, deep inside the data, there are only a handful of base sounds, reused again and again, with the pitch nudged up or down, the speed stretched or squashed, until a fierce dragon, a weak fish, and a tiny bug are all secretly cousins. For every mighty Gyarados bellow, there is a different cry that is really the same waveform in a different costume, saving precious bytes while still convincing trainers that each creature is distinct. The same thriftiness shapes what you see on screen. Towns and routes share tile sets, so a house in Pallet, a shop in Pewter, and a doorway in some quiet later city might all be drawn from the same tiny sheet of graphics, rearranged like a familiar puzzle. Many sprites are simplified, their details shaved away or even mirrored, so a Pokémon that looks proudly left in battle might simply be its right-facing twin, flipped around to avoid storing a second image. Placed together, these repeated patterns create that gentle sense of déjà vu as you walk. Different places, but built from the same comforting bricks. Even the Pokédex itself carries the imprint of those constraints. The internal order is not a grand lore tapestry, but a practical record of development, a list of which creatures were finished first. That is why some apparently important Pokémon sit surprisingly low in the numbering, while stranger or weaker ones appear earlier, sound as if they somehow mattered more. It is not about destiny or power. It is about when their sprites, cries, and move sets were finally squeezed into the cartridge without breaking anything else. Then there are the maps that never quite sprawl as far as your memory insists they did. Routes bend sharply instead of drifting on. Caves reuse rooms with small variations, and NPCs repeat roles and dialogue, not because the developers lacked imagination, but because every extra line of text, every new corner of coastline, had to fight for space with code and music. This is not a story of glory or victory. It is a story of fitting just enough into almost not enough. And all of those decisions ripple outward, shaping the paths you walk and the weak early encounters you face. The quiet roads just beyond Pallet Town, the simple trainers who wait with their Pidgey and Rattata, the gentle stretches of grass before you ever see a dramatic water route or a legendary creature, all exist within those limits. And as we follow those first steps out of Pallet, you can feel how the cartridge's tiny memory guided every tree, every ledge, and every sleepy battle along the way. From there, the game nudges you forward, and Route 1 opens like the simplest possible sentence written in pixels. A straight line of dirt and grass connecting the safety of Pallet Town to the unknown of Viridian City. There are no forks to choose between, no dark caves or branching paths, just a gentle slope upward with a few rectangular patches of grass, a couple of wandering NPCs, and a clear, almost childlike line from home to the first proper city. What makes Route 1 so interesting is how little it needs to say out loud to teach almost everything. The first time the grass rustles and a wild Pidgey appears, its tiny wings flapping in that stiff Game Boy animation. The game is quietly introducing the idea that tall grass means encounters, that stepping into those darker tiles is a choice that might lead to a battle. The Pidgey is weak, your starter is only slightly less helpless, and yet, the numbers are tuned so that even if you arrived underleveled, you are more likely to scrape through than faint. For every terrifying late-game dragon or perfectly EV-trained monster, there is this small bird and its purple counterpart, the Rattata that lunges with tackle and then does very little else. These creatures are frustrating in the long run, so the kind of Pokémon trainers run from without thinking later on, but here at level 2 and 3, they are soft obstacles, like foam padding on the edges of the game's rules. You trade blows, you watch your HP bar slide down in slow, deliberate chunks, and you learn what fainting might feel like without quite having to face it. Halfway along, an NPC stops you with a line of text and a small kindness. A free potion slipped into your bag before you have ever seen a Pokemart or a price tag. This is not a story of glory or victory. It is a tutorial disguised as a friendly stranger on a country road, teaching that items can mend a wounded creature, that you carry quiet insurance against a bad battle in those menu screens. You may not even need that potion on Route 1, but you remember that it exists. Settle in, close your eyes, and imagine walking that stretch over and over, grinding in the same 3 patches of grass until your starter's level ticks upward and the numbers feel a little safer. The encounter jingle repeats, the battle theme loops, and placed together, these tiny rituals become almost meditative. A rhythm of selecting tackle or scratch, watching pixels flash, hearing the same 8-bit cry from yet another ratata, then returning to the overworld with only a few HP lost. In that slow repetition, your brain quietly maps out how much damage you can take, how much experience each weak creature yields, and how far you can push before turning back to heal. The route is short, but it stretches in memory, a place where you first understood risk and reward in this world, where the grass is both danger and opportunity. And at the top of that gentle slope, the music shifts and Viridian City appears, a cluster of houses and important buildings that feels almost overwhelming after such a simple road. There is a Pokémon, a Pokémon Center, and tucked in the corner, a gym that refuses to open, its leader absent, its doors closed as if the game is whispering that power, and real battles lie ahead, but not yet. That quiet refusal will linger as you move on, a soft promise that beyond this softest possible challenge, Kanto is only beginning to unfold. So Viridian City becomes the first place where that promise takes shape, not just as a line of text on a sign, but as a feeling that lingers in the music and in the way the town is laid out. The theme here is gentle and looping, a little more complex than Pallet Town's lullaby, with just enough movement in those 8-bit notes to suggest that trainers come and go, that journeys begin and end here, even if, for now, yours is still very small. The streets are simple, almost toy-like, but they bend and curve just a little, adding a second screen, a few extra houses, a sense that this is a real settlement rather than a single row of homes. It is still cozy and manageable, the kind of place where you can settle in, close your eyes, and almost hear the soft whir of a Game Boy speaker under a blanket. What makes Viridian City so interesting is how it feels bigger than Pallet, without ever becoming overwhelming, a careful half step between your quiet home and the wider Kanto that waits beyond. And then, of course, there is the gym that refuses to cooperate. Its doors are locked, its sign gives only vague, almost unhelpful information, and an NPC simply tells you the leader is away, as if that should be enough. This is not a story of glory or victory yet. Instead, the building just sits there, a weak sort of monument to future power, asking you to remember it. For every open, welcoming Pokémon Center, there is this closed, silent gym, a reminder that some battles are being saved for much later. Nearby, another obstacle is far less intimidating and far more amusing. The old man sprawled in the street, blocking the northern route until he has his coffee, is one of Red's earliest jokes, a tiny, helpless gatekeeper who cannot even stand up until he's had his drink. And yet, this frustrating delay becomes your first formal lesson in catching Pokémon, his demonstration turning a grumpy NPC into a kind of accidental teacher, showing that even the weakest creature can be boxed up neatly with the right item. Placed together, these details quietly establish the rhythm you will repeat again and again. Heal at the Pokémon Center, stock up at the Pokémart, glance at the gym, check the routes, move on. The pattern is so simple that it almost disappears into the background. And yet, it is the backbone of the entire game, a soft metronome guiding every battle, every capture, every step. When you finally slip past the now awake old man and walk north, the music begins to fade behind you. The houses fall away and the path narrows. Ahead, the trees thicken. The light seems to dim, and the sign whispers a new name: Viridian Forest, a place that feels different from the rest of Kanto, as if the game is about to lower its voice and lead you into the dark. What waits in that quiet, optional tangle of trees is not stronger power, but something stranger. What waits in that quiet, optional tangle of trees is not stronger power, but something stranger. The moment the screen fades and redraws, the palette shifts to a dim, mossy green, and the music folds into that soft, looping pattern that seems to circle in place rather than march forward, as if the game itself is asking you to settle in. Close your eyes and listen to the forest breathe through a tiny Game Boy speaker. On that small, low-resolution window, Viridian Forest feels like a whole wilderness pressed into your hands, a self-contained world of trunks and shadows where the edges are always just off-screen. The trees form solid, blocky walls, but the gaps between them suggest paths that might exist, routes that could lead to secret items, or perhaps just loop back on themselves in a quiet little joke at the player's expense. This is not a story of glory or victory. It is a story of wandering, of soft footsteps in grass that you can't even see clearly, and the faint, stuttering cry of some unseen creature waiting to interrupt your thoughts. When the tall grass finally does answer, it does so with some of the weakest residents Kanto has to offer. Caterpie and Weedle arrive first. Simple bug-type Pokémon with tiny stats and even tinier ambitions, wiggling onto the screen with moves like Tackle and String Shot, or the slightly more threatening Poison Sting that feels more annoying than dangerous. For every majestic Charizard or stoic Blastoise that trainers dream about, there is a trembling little Caterpie that can barely stand up to a Pidgey. And yet, what makes Viridian's encounter table so interesting is how intentional it is. These fragile bugs are your first lesson in status, in poison slowly ticking your health down with each step, in the idea that a weak foe can still leave a lingering mark. Deeper in, the same idea hardens into Metapod and Kakuna, creatures that seem almost to refuse to battle at all, choosing harden over action, extending fights into long, sleepy stalemates. They are experienced piñatas more than opponents, quiet proof that not every Pokémon you meet is meant to feel powerful, that some exist to slow the pace, to make you notice how time stretches in this shaded maze. Placed together, these early bugs form a gentle tutorial in patience, in watching something evolve from helpless to merely adequate, and then, perhaps, to something more. Hidden among them, of course, is Pikachu, with an encounter rate so low that many players walked out of the forest without ever knowing it was there. Finding one feels like stumbling on a private secret, a silent handshake between the cartridge and the child who loved the anime, who wanted that particular electric mouse on their team, no matter how frustrating it might be to track down. On such a small screen, that rare flash of yellow against the greens and browns feels almost shocking, as if the forest itself briefly remembers that it can hold something famous. The layout helps sell the illusion. The paths bend, double back, and end in small dead ends with hidden items, encouraging you to turn around, to retrace your steps, to listen to the music loop again and again until it becomes part of the background hum of your thoughts. In reality, Viridian Forest is tiny, but by nudging you into little detours and side routes, the game convinces you that you have truly gone deep, that you are far from town and safety, guided only by that narrow strip of light at the top of the screen. And then, almost abruptly, the trees thin, the palette brightens, and the music changes. You step out of the dim, low-resolution wilderness and into the stone and certainty of Pewter City. where the quiet experiments of Viridian Forest give way to the first real test of your team and your starter choice. Under Brock's unblinking gaze, Pewter City feels like the game taking a slow, steady breath. After the greens and browns of the forest, you arrive in a town built from stone and silence, its square little houses edged with gray, its cliffs hemming you in like careful parentheses, and over all of it, that heavier, more deliberate music that settles into your ears and tells you, very gently, that playtime is over. The melody is still simple, still 8-bit and small, but the bass notes linger a little longer, and you can almost hear the designers whispering, "Settle in, close your eyes." This is where the real lessons begin. What makes Pewter City so interesting is how ordinary it looks and how quietly it changes the rules. The Pokémon Center and Mart are exactly where you expect. The fossils in the museum are static and harmless, and yet, just by walking upward toward that gym with its rocky icon, you are stepping into the first real argument between your choices and the world. For every cheerful Pallet Town promise, there is a pewter test, waiting behind a sliding door and a line of gray tiles. Inside, the gym is almost empty. Just a strip of stone, a couple of trainers, and Brock himself, standing perfectly still. His team in red is tiny. A Geodude and an Onix. Two lumpy, unimpressed rock types that look like they were carved out of the same wall you just walked past. They are not fast. They are not clever. They are simply resistant. A pair of weak-looking creatures that suddenly become terrifying when your moves bounce off them and their tackles chip away at your health. If you picked Charmander, this is not a story of glory or victory. This is a quiet reminder that fire and those normal-type scratches you've been leaning on do almost nothing to stone. The punishment is mild, but it is real. You throw out Ember, you watch the tiny damage bar barely move, and then you see Rock Tomb or Bide, or just a plain tackle threaten to undo the last 20 minutes of confident wandering. It feels helpless in a small, almost polite way. The game placing you in front of a wall and asking if you understand why it is a wall. Some trainers grind levels until Charmander can simply overpower the defense. Others wander back down Route 2, a little frustrated, and notice the hints that were waiting all along. The gym trainers talk about rock-type Pokémon and defense. An NPC in town mentions that water and grass moves are strong against rock, nudging you toward that Bulbasaur you could have taken, or the Squirtle you did not choose, or at least toward catching a Caterpie that evolves into Butterfree with confusion, or a Nidoran that can learn Double Kick. Placed together, these small voices form a quiet tutorial. Your starter is not enough. Your team must grow sideways as well as upward. And types are not just colors on a status screen, but rules that govern every battle. Losing to Brock the first time has a particular texture. It is not like fainting to a wild Pidgey. It feels official, stamped with a gym badge you do not yet have, and the walk back to the Pokémon Center is a little slower, your mind turning over possibilities. You might catch a Pidgey and realize it cannot help here, or pick up a Mankey on Route 22 in red, whose low kick suddenly makes Geodude feel fragile, or simply grind in the grass until your Ember, your Vine Whip, or your Bubble finally starts to bite into that Onix's long HP bar. Each attempt is a small adjustment, a nudge toward understanding. And when the boulder finally cracks and the badge icon appears in your inventory, the victory feels earned without ever being harsh. From there, Pewter's stone gates open onto something a little less certain. Beyond the city, the routes stretch longer, the caves grow darker, and the gentle gray of Brock's gym gives way to dim tunnels, wandering hikers, and the first hints that this world will not always show you its secrets so openly. The game has taught you how to lose softly. Now it begins to teach you how to look closely, to listen to its quiet corners, and to wonder what else might be waiting just out of sight, past the next patch of grass and the next pool of still, reflective water. From the bright sand-colored tiles of pewter, the path bends downward, and the light seems to dim almost politely, as if the game is lowering its voice before you step inside Mount Moon. This is not a story of glory or victory. It is a story of repetition, of soft echoes and small choices, of a place that quietly teaches trainers what it means to be patient in a world made of random encounters. The moment you enter, the music shifts into that hollow, looping cave theme, a few simple notes bouncing off unseen stone, repeating until it almost blends with the sound of your own thoughts. Then the first Zubat arrives, and the second, and the 15th. What begins as a mildly frustrating interruption slowly becomes a rhythm of its own, a flash of the battle screen, the thin, squeaky cry, the same weak creature flapping in a darkness you can't quite see. Settle in, close your eyes. You can almost hear each encounter as a metronome, ticking you deeper into the mountain. What makes Mount Moon so interesting is how deliberate that repetition really is. In Pokémon Red's encounter table, Zubat dominates the caves at low and mid levels, with Geodude and the rare Clefairy tucked in like quiet rewards for the persistent. For every exciting Clefairy or sturdy Geodude, there is yet another Zubat, its frail wings and limited moveset, reminding you how quickly your P-Pie and potions can drain away. The game is nudging you toward repels, toward counting steps, toward understanding that resource management is a kind of battle all its own. Zubat itself is almost helpless at this stage, a future Crobat locked behind generations that do not exist yet, stuck with leech life and supersonic, more annoyance than threat. And yet, placed together, these tiny interruptions teach you pacing, when to run, when to fight, when to simply accept that progress will be slow and a little repetitive. The cave becomes less a maze and more a meditation, broken only by the occasional hiker, the wandering youngster, and the first real hint of organized trouble. Because tucked among the stalagmites are Team Rocket grunts, early narrative shadows in an otherwise gentle world. Their Rattata and Sandshrew are not powerful, but they feel intentional, a reminder that other trainers move through these same tunnels with different goals. The conflict is small, almost polite, never loud enough to shatter the calm, but it lingers in the background, like another echoing note in the music. Deeper still, past the ladders and the scattered items, waits the fossil room, where a single scientist guards two ancient stones and an unexpectedly heavy decision: Dome or Helix, Kabuto or Omanite. At the time, it feels like a quiet fork in the path, one more choice among many in a game that rarely raises its voice. No one in 1996 could have guessed that this calm moment would evolve into the chaotic worship of Twitch Plays Pokémon, where the Helix fossil became an oracle, and this tiny, private choice turned into a worldwide meme. You leave with only one fossil, one future partner sleeping in stone, and the tunnel begins to brighten. The music fades, the Zubat finally retreat into the dark, and the cave's slow heartbeat gives way to open air and clear water. Ahead lies Cerulean City, a splash of blue rooftops and gentle rivers, and somewhere just off-screen, your rival is waiting, his team quietly shaped to mirror everything you've learned since you first stepped into the shade of Mount Moon. The moment you step into Cerulean's soft blue light, the game quietly introduces a new rhythm. You move forward, and just when you feel a little stronger, your rival steps in from the edge of the screen, a living checkpoint of everything you've learned so far. Settle in, close your eyes, and picture that first encounter on the Nugget Bridge route, where his smug greeting is less a welcome and more a reminder that this is not a story of glory or victory, at least not yet. What makes this first real rival battle so interesting is how carefully it's placed. You've just survived Mount Moon. Your team is patched together from weak cave creatures and early route stragglers. And then he appears, with a roster that feels like your reflection, only slightly sharpened. For every underleveled Pidgey you're still dragging along, there is his Pidgeotto, evolved, faster, and just strong enough to make your own bird look a bit helpless in comparison. As the journey continues to the SS Anne, that pattern deepens. There, among the gentle sway of the water and the quiet clink of dishes in the cabins, he arrives again, already adjusted to the new level curve, his starter's middle form waiting with a type advantage that feels almost personally frustrating. If you chose Charmander, his Wartortle is sitting there like a little blue wall. If you chose Squirtle, his Ivysaur calmly shrugs off water attacks. If you chose Bulbasaur, his Charmeleon threatens to burn through your careful planning in a single, overconfident swipe. And yet, his team never feels unfair. His levels hover just above yours. His movesets are tuned to expose gaps without becoming impossible, like a teacher who assigns homework that is always a bit harder than you want. In Pokémon Tower, he shows up among the ghosts and morning trainers. His Pokémon stronger, more evolved, but still within reach, still beatable if you've paid attention to type matchups and not relied on a single source of power. There is a quiet humor in watching his poor flying type repeatedly sent out into a world full of electric rodents and ice beams. A loyal but slightly outclassed creature that mirrors the weak links on your own team. By the time you reach Victory Road, that relationship has changed. He is no longer just an annoying interruption. Placed together, these repeated encounters have turned him into the only other person who has walked the same paths, crossed the same water, and faced the same gym leaders in roughly the same order. When he appears there, blocking the final stretch, his fully evolved starter, now the clean counter to yours, it feels less like a random battle and more like a quiet exam of your whole adventure. Pattern interrupt. Imagine, just for a moment, a Kanto without him at all. No taunting greetings, no slightly too strong teams, only silent roots and one-sided progress. The game would still function, but the emotional arc would be thinner, the tension softer, the sense of being measured against something almost entirely gone. From Cerulean onward, though, the world slowly opens around that rivalry. The routes begin to branch, offering side paths to Bill's cottage, detours to the daycare, and quiet corners where nothing important happens at all, except that your team grows. Beyond the rivals' early tests, Kanto starts to reveal its gentler, more optional spaces. Places where trainers can wander, level in peace, and let their weakest Pokémon evolve in their own time, as the journey drifts toward quieter discoveries. From those gentle grinding spots, the game starts to offer something even quieter. Little doors and tunnels that you never have to open at all, but that wait patiently if you do. In Pokémon Red, there is no glowing marker, no urgent arrow telling you where to turn. There is only a house with a second room, a cave with a side ledge, a patch of empty ground that looks just a little too deliberate. Settle in, close your eyes, and imagine walking those routes again. Not for battle or power, but just to see what was tucked away at the edges. Think of the back rooms in ordinary houses, the ones that so many trainers ran past in a hurry. The man in Pewter City who trades you a jinx hides behind a simple doorway. The old rod giver in Vermilion waits in a quiet back chamber. The copycat girl in Saffron sits in a side house that the main story never mentions. These spaces rarely hold anything dramatic. No legendary creature, no sudden rival fight, just flavor text, a small item, a hint that trades exist or that different versions of the game matter. This is not a story of glory or victory. It is a story of optional corners, the forgotten, the frustrating, and the faintly charming. Caves, too, have their secret shelves and side paths. In Mount Moon and Rock Tunnel, a narrow staircase or an odd little corridor might reward a curious step with a moonstone, a hidden ether, or a lonely trainer who speaks a single line about how dark it is. For every direct, efficient hallway that pushes you toward the exit, there's a stub of rock that exists only for the player who wonders, just once, what happens if they walk the other way? What makes Kanto so interesting is how weak the reward can be, and yet, how satisfying it still feels to find it. Then there are the invisible items, those silent tiles on the ground that never sparkle. A hidden rare candy by the Nugget Bridge, a secret item on the SS Anne's deck, a stray potion lying in the grass. They are easy to miss, and the game never scolds you if you do. You can finish the whole journey without them. Your team still evolves, the Elite Four still fall, and the story still ends. And yet, if you slow down, if you tap A in suspicious corners, the world quietly answers back with a small gift. Placed together, these missable corners give Pokémon Red a gentle replay pull. On a second or third trip through Kanto, trainers notice a door they never tried, an NPC they never spoke to, a room in Sylph Company that holds nothing but a scared employee and a desk. Imagine them drifting in the current of your memory, half remembered and slightly out of place, until one evening you walk there again and finally see what was always waiting. Some of the most famous secrets of Pokémon Red, though, aren't real at all. They're myths born from these quiet gaps in the map, and from the feeling that if an empty corner can hide a rare candy, maybe it can hide something much stranger. Those empty corners of Kanto invite the imagination, and once a few secrets turn out to be real, it becomes very easy to believe in the rest. Settle in, close your eyes, and picture the harbor at Vermilion City, the water gently looping against the pier, the SS Anne long gone, and one stubborn little rumor refusing to sail away with it. Somewhere off to the side, beyond where most trainers ever bother to walk, sits a single truck sprite, parked on its own little island of concrete. In a game where almost every object has a purpose, this silent, motionless creature of pixels felt important by default, and so the legend began. If you did something special here, Mew would appear from beneath the truck. Children whispered elaborate instructions. Keep your starter unevolved, never cut down a certain tree, lose on purpose to a specific trainer, then return after the ship leaves and use strength to push the truck. The steps were always oddly specific, almost ceremonial, as if the game itself were a ritual instead of a cartridge. What makes this rumor so interesting is how believable it felt at the time. The truck is out of the way, disconnected from the main path, and Pokémon Red is not full of purely decorative clutter, so this lonely vehicle gained a weight it never earned. For every obvious signposted secret, there is one quiet detail like this, sitting there and inviting the question, why would the developers draw this if it did nothing? And yet, no matter how many times players tried to surf around it, strengthen, or press A on every possible tile, the result was always the same. Nothing happened. Just a truck, and a slightly embarrassed trainer standing next to it. Around that, other playground tales grew like weeds along the edge of the map. There were rumors of a hidden way to battle Professor Oak, where his team would be impossibly strong. A final exam waiting for only the bravest or most stubborn. Some swore you could catch Yoshi as a secret Pokémon, smuggled in from some other game entirely, a bright green outsider hiding in the tall grass. Others described slipping past the borders of Kanto itself, walking beyond the screen into glitched shorelines and secret islands that sounded more like ghost stories than game mechanics. This was a time when the internet moved slowly, when many trainers had no guides at all, just cousins, schoolyards, and the occasional magazine. Myths spread like campfire tales, repeated slightly wrong each time, and placed together. These stories wrapped a straightforward adventure in something softer and stranger. This is not a story of glory or victory. It is a story of half-truths and almost possibilities, of weak evidence and strong belief. Imagine them drifting in the current of memory. The truck, the hidden professor, the impossible Yoshi, all helplessly untrue. Most of them anyway. Because while the legends were mostly empty, some of Pokémon Red's glitches were very real, and their quiet power could bend Kanto in ways no rumor ever quite described. Most of them anyway. Because while the legends were mostly empty, some of Pokémon Red's glitches were very real, and their quiet power could bend Kanto in ways no rumor ever quite described. Settle in, close your eyes, and imagine the game not as a perfect machine, but as a tired little cartridge that sometimes slips, just for a moment, into a strange, flickering dream. What makes Missing No so interesting is how ordinary its doorway feels. You talk to the old man in Viridian City, the one who insists on teaching you how to catch a Pokémon, even when you have already beaten half the region, and the game politely remembers your name by tucking it away in memory. Then you fly to Cinnabar Island, step out onto that narrow eastern shore, and walk up and down along the edge where water meets land. No caves, no haunted towers, just waves, sand, and suddenly, something that should not be there. Behind the scenes, the encounter data for that coastal strip is never fully written, so the game reaches for whatever is nearby in memory. In Red's simple mind, your player name becomes a kind of recipe for wild encounters. Each letter is quietly misread as a number, and those numbers point to species, levels, and items that were never meant to appear. For every normal Rattata in the grass, there is this broken creature in the surf, stitched together from leftover values and half-finished thoughts. When Missing No appears, it does not stride into battle with elegant animation. It arrives as a jagged, blocky mass, like a corrupted puzzle piece, its cry stretched and warped, its sprite sometimes tearing the battle screen into vertical strips. And yet, it is not hostile so much as helpless, a weak fragment of data that accidentally wandered into the spotlight. Catching it can duplicate the sixth item in your bag, turning rare candies or Master Balls into an overflowing hoard. Fleeing can leave your Hall of Fame scrambled with nonsense names and impossible levels, as if your proud victories have been rewritten by a sleep-talking narrator. Missing No was not alone in this. Item underflow tricks let patient trainers sell and scroll their way into negative spaces in the bag, where key items, glitch TMs, and invisible entries waited like forgotten furniture in a dark attic. Walk-through walls codes and similar exploits allowed you to step outside the map's solid borders, drifting over water, cliffs, and houses, a silent ghost gliding past NPCs who never turn their heads. These were not proper features. They were the game's nervous habits, revealed when players pressed just a little too hard. This is not a story of glory or victory. It is a story of boundaries bending, of rules quietly failing. And then, after the thrill of breaking through the edges, attention returns to what lies inside those borders. Even without glitches, Red's normal systems, stats that grow unevenly, types that counter and fold into each other, move sets that arrive late or not at all, hide their own small secrets, less dramatic than missing no, but just as quietly powerful, waiting to be noticed as you imagine them drifting in the current of Kanto's design. So, settle in, close your eyes, and let those quiet systems underneath the pixels rise slowly to the surface. If the map and the glitches are the visible borders and cracks of Kanto, then the stats and types are the underground springs, feeding every single battle without most trainers ever really seeing them. In Pokémon Red, every creature carries 5 hidden numbers: HP, attack, defense, speed, and special. They never appear on the screen as neat formulas. Yet they decide who faints first, whose move lands harder, who can take one more hit before that familiar, slightly harsh Game Boy chime. Some Pokémon are born with big, comfortable HP cushions, others with sharp, glass cannon attack, and a few, like poor Magikarp, feel as if they were allocated their points by a half-asleep accountant, leaving them weak, helpless, and almost comically underqualified for the job of battling. What makes Red so interesting is how simple those labels look, and how unevenly they play out. Special is a single, catch-all stat, quietly handling both special attack and special defense, which means that some species, like Alakazam, aren't just smart, they are walls and cannons at the same time. For every sturdy onyx that looks dangerous, but hits like a thrown pebble, there is a fragile Kadabra that folds in a physical battle, yet melts almost anything with a single psychic wave. And then there is the type chart, that invisible web of strengths and weaknesses you probably learned not from a guide, but from trial and error and the occasional frustrating loss. In Generation 1, Psychic might as well be a force of nature. Almost nothing resists it. Bug is supposed to counter it, but has weak moves and almost no strong users. And Ghost, thanks to a quirk in the data, doesn't actually hurt Psychic at all. For every majestic water type, like Lapras, that shrugs off hits and feels trustworthy, there is a poor bug-type user in the tall grass, flailing away with Twin Needle, and feeling like the game itself is gently laughing. Critical hits, too, hide a quiet oddity. In Red, they are tied directly to speed. So fast Pokémon like Jolteon or Persian land far more crits than you might expect, turning quick, light creatures into sudden burst damage threats. Slow, heavy bruisers, the ones that look powerful, often swing and merely tap, while these nimble figures slice through health bars almost by accident. Most children never knew the formulas, never calculated damage ranges, never heard of effort values, or the tiny individual differences inside each stat. They just noticed that Pidgey felt reliable, that Rattata fainted a lot, that Charizard eventually stopped feeling so helpless against the world. This is not a story of glory or victory. It is a story of guesses, of swapping out fainted partners, of learning that electric beats water because the animation looked right and the result felt satisfying. Placed together, these hidden numbers and quiet type quirks form a secret current beneath Kanto. And yet, beyond the stats and charts, each species carries its own small story, from the common root one birds you barely remember, to the legendary creatures sleeping in caves, waiting for the moment when numbers and narrative finally meet. And yet, for all the talk of hidden values and clever type charts, most trainers' journeys in Red don't begin with a legendary creature or a perfectly optimized partner. They begin with something much smaller, much weaker, and much more ordinary. Before the game offers fossils, dragons, or mysterious psychic types, it quietly hands you Pidgey and Rattata on Route 1, as if to say, settle in, close your eyes. This is not a story of glory or victory just yet. Pidgey is usually the first non-starter companion that joins the team, a tiny brown bird that looks like it could be shooed away from a windowsill rather than sent into battle. Its stats in red are as modest as its appearance. Average speed, soft attack, and a move pool that begins with simple, normal-type tackles and only slowly grows into gust and later wing attack, which, in Generation 1, is still just a normal-type move pretending to be something more exotic. What makes Pidgey so interesting is how deliberately usable but unthreatening it feels. Strong enough to peck through early bug catchers, never strong enough to dominate the game. Rattata fills the same role from the ground, a little purple rodent with sharp teeth and sharper ambitions than its base stats can really support. In red, it scurries in with high speed for such a small creature, and a surprisingly decent attack, backed by tackle, quick attack, and later Hyper Fang, a move that always feels a bit too dramatic for something that faints to a stiff breeze. For every imposing Nidoking or Alakazam that eventually joins a team, there is a Rattata quietly handling the first few routes, taking hits it probably shouldn't survive, and making early battles feel just dangerous enough to be exciting without ever becoming truly frightening. Placed together, these two form the backbone of countless early game teams. Even though the design clearly expects you to phase them out as Kanto opens up. Their base stats plateau, their move pools slow down, and by the time you reach Vermilion or Lavender, stronger and stranger options have appeared, whispering that it might be time to box that faithful bird or that chipped-tooth rat. And yet, many trainers keep them anyway, carrying a Pidgeotto or Raticate far beyond what any guide would recommend, simply because they were there first. Part of that attachment comes from tiny details that make Red's world feel alive in its most modest corners. Pidgey's Pokédex entry describes it as docile, preferring to kick up sand rather than pick a fight, matching its soft, fluttering Game Boy cry that sounds more like a sigh than a screech. Rattata's entry notes how it chews through anything and appears everywhere, and its higher-pitched, slightly frantic cry fits that restless, almost helpless energy. These are not majestic water dragons or rare fossils. They are background creatures that somehow become main characters by proximity and persistence. As you walk farther from Pallet Town, the routes stretch longer, the grass deepens, and the Pokémon you meet begin to grow stranger, more specialized, more distinct to each location. Soon the simple birds and rodents give way to cave-dwelling oddities, haunted towers, and shoreline species, with their own quiet trivia. Each new encounter, another small step away from home, and another reason to keep drifting through Kanto's gentle pixelated night. As the routes stretch out and the shoreline fades, the game quietly leads you downward, away from open air and into places where the ceiling presses close, and the music seems to echo inside your head. Settle in, close your eyes, and imagine that first step into Mount Moon, when the bright, simple world of early Kanto suddenly narrows into a cramped little maze of ladders, boulders, and softly looping notes that feel just a little too minor to be comforting. Mount Moon is not a hard dungeon, not really. The wild Pokémon are weak, the path is short, and most trainers will stumble through on their first try. And yet, what makes Mount Moon so interesting is how much mood it wrings out of almost nothing. A darker palette, a few flickering tiles pretending to be rocks, and a soundtrack that never quite resolves. Like a question the game refuses to answer. For every confident Pidgey, that carried you through Route 3. There is a helpless Zubat here, flapping into battle again and again, more frustrating than threatening, turning the cave into a slow, repetitive lullaby of wing beats and escape attempts. By the time Rock Tunnel arrives, the game stops pretending that caves are friendly at all. The designers place a simple requirement in your path: Flash, an HM that feels underwhelming in battle, but absolutely decisive in this single, dark corridor. If you bring it, the tunnel blooms into view, still oppressive, but readable. If you don't, the screen shrinks to a tiny white halo around your sprite, and the whole space becomes a nearly blind exercise in trial and error, like feeling along the wall in an unfamiliar room. Some players stubbornly refuse to use Flash, step by careful step, memorizing collisions with hikers and wild Geodude, as if the cave itself were teaching them its layout through gentle bumps. Then, much later, the game trades rock for ritual, and the climb shifts from underground to upward. Pokémon Tower in Lavender Town is still built from the same tiny tiles and limited colors, but the tone changes completely. No more earthy browns, just pale floors, thin walls, and a soft, mournful theme that sounds less like a battle march and more like a hymn. This is not a story of glory or victory. Instead, you walk among NPCs who speak openly of loss, of departed partners, of graves and rest, while ghost-type encounters drift toward you in the form of Ghastly and Haunter, creatures that feel less like opponents and more like echoes. Placed together, these three spaces sketch an emotional gradient using almost no tools at all. Mount Moon offers mild confusion and the first hint that this world can be a little unfriendly. Rock Tunnel tightens that feeling into tension, a literal darkness that makes each step uncertain. Pokémon Tower loosens the grip again, but replaces fear with melancholy, inviting you to imagine them drifting in the current between life and death, watched over by a tower full of quiet mourners. For a game remembered for its bright sprites and simple battles, it is remarkable how gently it guides trainers through confusion, unease, and finally reflection. And yet, Lavender Town in particular would not stay gentle forever in players' minds. Its simple theme, its tower, and its ghosts would evolve into something much stranger in the years after release, spawning stories and rumors that still linger in the dark, waiting just beyond the next screen. Lavender Town is where that gentle unease finally settles into something sharper, a place where the game stops hinting and simply lets you sit with the feeling that something is wrong. Settle in, close your eyes, and you can probably still hear it. That thin, wavering melody in a minor key, climbing and falling, in those high, glassy tones that feel more like a distant signal than a song. Most town themes in Pokémon Red are simple and bright, built on bouncy rhythms and friendly intervals that tell you it's safe to breathe. Lavender's theme does the opposite. It leans on dissonant intervals, those slightly off-kilter notes that never quite resolve, and a repetitive, almost hypnotic pattern that seems to circle back on itself without finding rest. It is noticeably sadder than Palette's gentle nostalgia or Cerulean's light adventure, like listening to a music box that has been left in the rain, still turning, but just a little warped. Inside the town, the music's mood becomes context instead of just background. Lavender is dominated by the Pokémon Tower, a tall grave monument instead of a bustling department store or a proud gym. And the NPCs here speak in short, heavy lines about lost partners, departed friends, and battles that did not end with victory. This is not a story of glory or victory. It is a story of what happens after the battle, when a weak creature doesn't get back up, when a beloved team member never returns to its Pokeball. The Marowak ghost gives that feeling a face. You climb the tower, step by step, listening to that same sad theme fold into the tower's echoing interior. And you meet a spirit that cannot move on because it died protecting its child. For every triumphant evolution animation, there is this quiet moment where a mother's story ends. Not with power, but with absence. Many trainers met the idea of death here for the first time, not as a vague concept, but as a specific, named Pokémon, whose grief-filled sprite blocked the way. Years later, that atmosphere would be stretched into something stranger. The so-called Lavender Town Syndrome creepypasta claimed that the original music harmed children, that its high-pitched tones hid dangerous frequencies. It is fiction, of course. There is no secret data, no lost cartridge that the developers buried. And yet, what makes Lavender Town so interesting is how believable the rumor felt, precisely because the town already sounded like a place you weren't meant to linger, a place where the Game Boy's tiny speaker suddenly seemed too small for the emotion it was trying to carry. Pattern interrupt. Imagine them drifting in the current. All those rumors, all those screenshots, all those invented beta tracks, swirling around a very simple 8-bit tune. Placed together, these stories and that melody turn a short mid-game stop into a legend, even though, in the code, it is just another location with an encounter table and a tile set. For many players, Lavender Town quietly taught that a Pokémon world built on battles and experience points also has room for funerals, for altars, for NPCs who do nothing but mourn. Some of them stand in front of individual graves. Some speak to Pokémon you will never meet. And their words are small, but heavy, like items you can't pick up. It is a surprisingly gentle introduction to grief, wrapped in a cartridge that also lets you surf across bright blue water and toss Pokeballs at helpless common creatures. And then, just as softly, the game leads you away again. You calm the ghost, you help Cubone, you restore order to the tower, and the path bends back toward roots filled with sunlight, fishermen, and the comforting rhythm of ordinary battles. From Lavender's muted grays and purples, you step out to brighter grass, to more traditional adventure beats, and the music shifts back to something you can hum without feeling a chill. The sadness never fully leaves, though. It lingers like a faint echo, making every later victory feel just a little more fragile. As the journey continues toward new cities and stronger opponents, the memory of that tower and its song follows quietly behind. A reminder that even in this simple game, not every story evolves into power, and not every path leads up a league staircase bathed in light. From that lingering echo in the tower, the journey drifts back toward the sea, and suddenly the world feels lighter again, like stepping out of a dim room into salt air and sunlight. In Vermilion City, the docks are quiet, the water a flat sheet of blue pixels, and there, waiting like a visiting dream, is the SS Anne. A whole little world that exists for a moment and then is gone. When you first hand over the ticket and walk up the gangplank, the music shifts, trading the cheerful city tune for something a little more formal, a little more refined, as if the game is asking you to settle in, close your eyes, and pretend this is a grand luxury cruise instead of a handful of rectangles on a tiny screen. This is not a story of glory or victory. It is a story of a limited-time hallway, a fragile place that quietly warns you that not everything in Kanto will wait forever. For every permanent route or evergreen forest, there is this ship, here now, and then only a memory. Inside, the layout is simple and strangely satisfying. Narrow corridors run left and right, lined with cabin doors that open into tiny rooms, each one a self-contained bubble of trainers, items, and brief battles. Some cabins hide seasick gentlemen, some hide enthusiastic sailors with weak water-type Pokémon who somehow still believe a level 17 Tentacool is terrifying, and some simply offer a bed where you can heal, as if the game knows this miniature maze on the water might wear you down more than you expect. What makes the SS Anne so interesting is how small it really is, and yet how it feels like a full chapter placed together. These rooms form a little labyrinth afloat. At the far end of one passage, your rival appears again, as if he, too, has paid for a ticket just to ruin the mood. His team is stronger now, more evolved, a reminder that time is moving forward, even in this sealed-off space, and that every battle nudges the story along whether you feel ready or not. Defeating him clears the way to the captain's quarters, where a seasick man leans over a trash can, and your reward for a gentle back rub is HM01 Cut, a humble little move that quietly unlocks half the region. A single slash on a small tree, and suddenly new paths unfold. And yet, players quickly learned that this ship was fragile in another way. Rumors spread that if you never used Cut on that first tree, or never triggered the departure, you could one day return with Surf, glide across the harbor, and find secret Pokémon or hidden items waiting on the pier, especially that lonely truck sprite parked off to the side like an unanswered question. For every confirmed glitch or discovered secret in Pokémon Red, there is that helpless, frustrating myth of the truck, stubbornly refusing to yield anything at all. Once you finally disembark and watch the SS Anne pull away, its music fading into the regular Vermilion theme, Kanto feels a little larger and a little less safe. The mid-game gyms begin to test more than just your levels. They start to probe your understanding of types, of status, of how a weak creature can still ruin a battle with a single paralysis or sleep. The world opens, the training deepens, and the calm blue water around Vermilion quietly hints that the journey ahead will demand more thought than brute power alone. From Vermilion onward, the game starts to smile a little more sharply at the player, and yet, it never quite raises its voice. Lieutenant Surge's electric gym is the first real sign that Kanto is willing to be a little frustrating on purpose. Not with a brutal battle, but with that quietly infamous trash can switch puzzle. 2 hidden switches, buried under a grid of identical bins, introduce a flicker of randomness into an adventure that has mostly felt predictable and fair, like ripples on otherwise calm water. What makes Lieutenant Surge's gym so interesting is how low stakes the annoyance really is. The electric types inside can hit hard, and a weak creature underleveled or lacking ground coverage might feel helpless. But the true obstacle is the act of checking, failing, and resetting the switches over and over. It is a gentle test of patience rather than power, a way of asking trainers to slow down, to accept that sometimes progress in Pokémon Red is not about winning a battle, but about methodically combing through identical tiles until the path opens. This is not a story of glory or victory. It is a story of poking metal cans. By the time players reach Celadon, the tone softens again. Erica's grass gym is almost the opposite of Surge's harsh metal and electric barriers, trading switches and sparks for flowers, foliage, and trainers half hidden among the greenery. Some of them blend into the scenery so well that you can walk past without noticing, like quiet spectators rather than eager opponents, and the difficulty spike feels more like a gentle hill than a wall. Her grass Pokémon can be annoying with status moves, but they rarely feel overwhelming. For every paralyzing Pikachu back in Vermilion, there is a dozy Bellsprout here, swaying back and forth, more sleepy than threatening. Placed together, these two gyms show how Game Freak used simple visual gimmicks to give each leader a distinct identity within the strict limits of the Game Boy's tiny screen. Surge's room is all straight lines, metal, and repetition, while Erica's is soft shapes, flowers, and hidden trainers, and both remain memorable decades later. Then Fuchsia takes that idea and makes it just a bit stranger. Koga's poison gym covers the floor with invisible walls, turning the screen into a quiet maze where the player walks into nothing, again and again, trying to map out the unseen. Here, the battles finally lean into status as a real threat. Poison types chip away at health, toxic ramps up damage, and suddenly antidotes and healing items stop being optional and start feeling essential. A weak team can be worn down without ever losing to a single big hit, like a long, slow leak. Imagine them drifting in the current. Surge's switches, Erica's foliage, Koga's invisible barriers. 3 small tricks that reshape how trainers move, fight, and prepare. As you settle in, close your eyes, the gyms fade behind you, and the routes between Vermilion, Celadon, and Fuchsia begin to stretch out, full of their own quiet stories about version exclusives, trades, and the gentle tug-of-war between what your copy of Pokémon Red can offer and what lies just out of reach in someone else's game. Those routes don't just decide which trainers you meet or which weak little creature jumps out of the grass. They also quietly decide which version of Kanto you're actually walking through. In Pokémon Red, the world looks the same as blue on the surface. And yet, just beneath that familiar pixel sky, the encounter tables split the region in 2. For every rattling, Ratata, or ever-present Pidgey that both cartridges share, there is something that belongs only to Red, and something that belongs only to Blue. Ekans slithers through Red's tall grass, while Blue players are followed instead by Sandshrews' scratchy little footsteps. Oddish, with its sleepy leaves and surprisingly sturdy battle potential, roots itself in Red, while Bellsprout waves its awkward vine arms over in Blue. Mankey, that permanently annoyed fighting type, takes up residence on Red's early routes, changing how trainers handle Brock and Misty, while Blue quietly offers different tools, different teammates, different answers. What makes this so interesting is how gentle the design really is. The game never shouts that your cartridge is incomplete, never calls you helpless, never tells you that your Pokédex will stop at 150 and stay there. It simply lets you notice, slowly, that certain silhouettes never appear, that some Pokédex entries sit empty, that your team composition leans toward poison here or grass there, all because Ekans exists for you and not Sandshrew, because Oddish is yours and Bellsprout is someone else's. Placed together, that these quiet absences form a kind of soft puzzle. This is not a story of glory or victory. It's a story of 2 half-finished collections, 2 cartridges that each pretend to be whole while hiding a few creatures just out of reach. The only real solution is not grinding, not some secret area, but another person, another Game Boy, another copy of the game. So the link cable appears, a simple gray thread that turns solitary, backlit play into a shared ritual. 2 chunky handhelds, pushed close together on a carpet or a school desk, joined by a wire that feels almost like a physical promise. You scroll to Ekans. They scroll to Sandshrew. Someone hesitates. Someone laughs. Then you both press A. The trade animation begins, slow and strangely tense for such tiny sprites. Your Pokémon slides into the cable, becomes a little packet of light, and drifts across to the other screen. Imagine them drifting in the current, your long-trained partner leaving your game forever, while a new one swims back toward you, unfamiliar, a little awkward, but full of potential power. There is trust in that moment, and a faint, frustrating fear that something might go wrong, that the link will break, that your creature will vanish into the void between systems. And sometimes, that risk was more than sentimental, because a few Pokémon would never reach their final form unless they passed through that cable at least once. Some evolutions, some of the strongest shapes hidden inside Kanto's data, are locked behind cooperation. And the game is quietly waiting to show you what happens when a trade doesn't just move a partner, but transforms it. Those transforming trades are where the game quietly tightens the knot between strength and connection, asking you to link hands before it lets certain creatures show their full shape. In Pokémon Red, a few familiar partners sit right on that threshold. Kadabra waiting to become Alakazam, Machoke straining to turn into Machamp, Haunter lingering in the dark before it finally becomes Gengar, and even poor Graveler, who only reaches Golem if it survives a brief trip through someone else's Game Boy. Each of these base forms is already more than a helpless weakling, which is what makes them so interesting in this quiet little system. Kadabra hits hard and fast. Haunter slips through walls with that eerie smile. Machoke looks like it has already finished its gym routine for the day. And Graveler can roll through early game teams without much trouble. They are not Magikarp flopping on the metaphorical shore. They stand on their own in battle, and yet their final numbers, their polished designs, their true power, all wait behind a cable, like a door that only opens when two trainers agree to turn the handle together. For every Charizard that evolves alone just by leveling up, there is a Machamp that simply will not appear unless someone, somewhere, is willing to trade. That simple condition turns these evolutions into tiny social quests. You might remember sitting in a classroom or on a long car ride, holding your Game Boy a little too tightly while the link cable clicked in, hoping the other cartridge would be kind to your partner. Settle in, close your eyes, and you can almost hear that soft connection chime again. Of course, not everyone had that luxury. Some players had the game but no link cable, or a cable, but no one else nearby who cared about Kanto's data. For them, Alakazam and Gengar became almost mythical shapes, seen in magazine screenshots, strategy guides, or briefly on a cousin's save file. The Pokédex promised that Haunter evolves when traded, but if you were alone with your cartridge, that line could feel a little frustrating, like a secret club you were never invited to join. When a trade did happen, there was a small, bittersweet ritual hidden in the pixels. You chose your Haunter or your Machoke, watched the screen fade as it left your team, and trusted that your friend would send it back instead of keeping this new, freshly evolved powerhouse for themselves. For a few seconds, you were weak on purpose, handing away your best fighter so it could come home stronger. This is not a story of glory or victory. It is a story of trust between children, filtered through cables and sprites. And then, quietly, the game goes back to pretending it is just numbers and battles. Yet, placed together, these little moments of connection sit beside something even softer. The NPCs who never fight you at all, who just stand on routes and in houses, offering one-line stories that drift past like background noise. Beyond trades and stats, the world of Red is filled with those quiet voices. And the next step through Kanto's night is to listen to what they've been saying all along. So, settle in, close your eyes, and imagine the camera of that tiny Game Boy screen, slowing down even further, or drifting away from battles and badges and into the lives of the people who never move at all. These are not gym leaders or champions. This is not a story of glory or victory, but of the background figures who stand in place forever, repeating the same weak little lines that somehow linger in memory, long after the last Pokémon fainted. For every rival who rushes ahead of you, there is a youngster, rooted to the same patch of grass, proudly declaring his love for shorts. He challenges you to a battle, of course, but what makes him so interesting is not his team or his strategy. It is that oddly specific sentence about shorts being comfy and easy to wear, delivered with the unwavering confidence of someone who has never questioned his fashion choices. The creatures on his team might be forgettable, the battle itself simple, and yet, that one line turned into one of the series' most enduring jokes, a tiny human moment preserved in pixels. Further along the journey, the stillness turns heavier in Lavender Town, where the NPCs do not boast, they mourn. A girl stands by a grave and whispers that her Pokémon was killed by Team Rocket. An old man shuffles near the tower and talks about visiting departed partners. Another trainer quietly wonders if his lost companion is lonely. These characters never move from their posts, never evolve past that single sentence, but each line hints at a life outside the screen, at battles fought, friendships formed, and sudden helpless endings. Placed together, these fragments create a soft chorus of grief that makes the tower feel colder than any water route. Then, in Celadon City, the mood tilts from sorrow into something gently playful as you find the Game Freak developer's room hidden above the department store. Inside, NPCs sit behind desks and admit they are making the very game you're playing, breaking the fourth wall with a shrug and a smile. One claims to be the scriptwriter, another the programmer, all of them frozen in the act of creating a world that has already been finished for decades. For every mourning villager in Lavender, there is a designer in Celadon, quietly reminding you that this entire region was built, line by line, by people you will never truly meet. What makes these NPCs so interesting is that they never change, no matter how many times you reset the cartridge or how strong your team evolves to become. They do not gain power, they do not grow old. They simply stand there, waiting for you to press A again, looping the same words while you move on, catching new Pokémon, leaving weak partners behind, and forgetting yesterday's frustrating battle. Imagine them drifting in the current of Kanto's timeline, anchored to one tile while you sweep past, always forward, towards something new. And yet, that forward motion is what gives their stillness meaning, because while they remain in place, you eventually outgrow the towns and the gentle roots and reach something stranger. A dark, optional cave near Cerulean, waiting off the main path. As the screen fades and the water at its entrance ripples quietly, Kanto's most mysterious endgame corner comes into view, and the world of fixed NPCs gives way to something far more dangerous hidden in the dark. From the outside, Cerulean Cave does not look like much, just another dark hole tucked behind a small pool of water, guarded for most of the game by a single NPC, who simply tells you that you are not allowed inside. In a world where so many doors open as soon as you reach them, this one is stubborn, quietly insisting that you finish everything else first, that you defeat the Elite Four, become champion, and only then be trusted with whatever weak little Game Boy cartridge secret is humming in the dark beyond that sign. For every early cave filled with Zubat and Geodude, there is this place, waiting patiently in the post-game, its entrance blocked off until the credits have rolled and the main story has already declared your victory. What makes Cerulean Cave so interesting is how unnecessary it is. Trainers can ignore it completely and still have a complete journey, and yet, once you know it is there, the thought of that locked door can be strangely frustrating, like an itch at the edge of the map that refuses to go away until you finally surf across and step inside. When you do, the tone shifts immediately. The wild Pokémon, are not the harmless creatures of Route 1 anymore. Instead, high-level Golbat, Kadabra, and even fully evolved Raiden and Chansey roam the floors, turning every random battle into something that can actually hurt, even this late. Cerulean Cave becomes a quiet, grinding spot and a final exam at the same time. A place where underleveled teams are exposed and where a careless misstep can leave you feeling oddly helpless, watching your health bars melt in encounters you thought you were far too strong to fear. The layout itself is messy and almost rude, with ladders that seem to loop back on themselves, ledges that punish a wrong step, and pools of water that force you to bring surf one more time, even though the main story is long over. You follow this awkward path downward, past more high-level creatures, until eventually the cave stops branching and simply narrows into a single, silent chamber. No music change, no dialogue, no speech from a professor. Just one Pokémon standing there, Mewtwo, waiting, as if it has been aware of you since the moment you first chose a starter. This is not a story of glory or victory. The game does not frame the encounter with fanfare, and if you accidentally knock Mewtwo out, there is no second chance, only that dull little sound effect and an empty platform. Catching it can feel oddly subdued too. A few Ultra Balls, a soft click, and then a new name in your party menu. As if this creature of overwhelming power has simply agreed to sit quietly beside your Pidgey and your old, tired water type. Placed together, these moments feel like a gentle epilogue, a final test whispered rather than shouted. And yet, as you settle in, close your eyes and let the thought of that last chamber fade. There is still one more presence hiding in the game's code, mentioned in rumors and schoolyard stories, not standing in any cave at all. Imagine them drifting in the current of data. Mew, the unseen counterpart to Mewtwo, unreachable by normal means. A legendary secret that suggests that even beyond the deepest dungeon, Kanto is still keeping one last quiet mystery from you. Mew is the kind of secret that feels like it should only exist in whispers. And yet, in Pokémon Red, it was living right there inside the cartridge the whole time. Settle in, close your eyes, and picture that tiny Game Boy board. Memory chips packed tight, every tile, every cry, every weak little creature squeezed into a few hundred kilobytes. And in the middle of all that, one programmer quietly deciding there was room for just one more. Near the end of development, after the debug tools were stripped out to free space, programmer Shigeki Morimoto slipped Mew into the leftover bytes, almost like a prank on the future. No formal meeting, no big design document, just a small experiment tucked into the code, with the understanding that no normal trainers would ever meet it. It was an act that feels both harmless and a little mischievous, as if someone had drawn a secret doodle behind the game's wallpaper and walked away, assuming no one would ever peel it back. In ordinary play, Mew simply doesn't exist. You can beat every gym, clear Victory Road, stare at every patch of grass and every dark corner, and this Pokémon never appears. It has no tall grass encounter, no cave, no surf spot. Its Pokédex slot is filled, but the game never offers it to you. What makes Mew so interesting is that it's fully functional, with stats, moves, and its own cry, and yet the only ways to reach it are through special distributions, trade, or the kinds of glitches that feel like you're arguing with the game's logic until it finally gives in. For every legendary that stands proudly in a cave, there is this hidden counterpart, quiet and almost embarrassed to be there. Early on, internal test cartridges and accidental distributions let Mew slip into the wild, and rumors began to spread faster than any official announcement. Magazines printed stories about secret events, kids traded cartridges that definitely had Mew on them, and Nintendo leaned into it with real-world distributions, turning a leftover debug toy into a marketing phenomenon. This is not a story of glory or victory in battle. Mew itself is not some terrifying monster, just a small, slightly underwhelming pink creature with a huge move pool and a reputation far bigger than its sprite. Then the glitches arrived, the pattern interrupt that made everything feel unstable. Talk of trucks near the SS Anne, strange trainer encounters, specific tile steps that, if followed perfectly, would make Mew appear at level 7, as helpless as a newly caught Rattata. And yet, these myths made Kanto feel deeper, as if the water extended far beyond the shore you could see. Placed together, these 151 entries become more than numbers. The Pokédex turns into a quiet catalog of this world, where even the smallest line can be unsettling. As you think of Mew hiding in unused space, the next step is to open that digital book and notice how many descriptions hint at danger, extinction, or strange powers that no ordinary battle ever shows you. So you settle in, close your eyes, and that quiet catalog suddenly has a purpose, because Professor Oak presses it into your hands almost as soon as you leave Pallet Town, turning this little red device into your main assignment for the rest of the game. It is not just a menu, it is homework disguised as adventure, a gentle request from an old man that you, a brand new trainer, should see and record every creature in Kanto. Oak's explanation is simple and almost sleepy. He once tried to document all Pokémon himself, but he grew old, and now the task passes to you and to your rival in a way that makes catching things feel less like a battle obsession and more like quiet field research. For every gym badge, there is a new Pokédex page. For every dramatic rival fight, there is a moment afterward where you scroll down the list and notice one more number filled in, one more tiny sprite blinking back at you. What makes this Pokédex so interesting is that its order is not based on any grand myth or story arc. Instead, it reflects the order in which the developers created these sprites and data, which is why something as unassuming as Caterpie sits all the way up at number 10, while powerful creatures like Dragonite wait patiently near the end. For every legendary bird, there is a surprisingly early bug, and yet the game never tells you this. It just lets the odd placements feel like one more bit of quiet mystery. Inside those numbers, the text itself can be surprisingly dark, especially for a tool that is supposed to educate. Charmander's entry calmly warns that its life ends if the flame on its tail goes out, turning a starter choice into something a little fragile, a little helpless. Ghastly is described as enveloping opponents in gas that can suffocate them, which is a lot for a round face with a smile. Kadabra allegedly appears when a child with psychic powers wakes up one morning transformed, a detail that sounds less like game data and more like a campfire story whispered after lights out. Placed together, these unsettling sentences sit right beside gentler ones about height and weight, so that danger and mundanity share the same tiny screen. Late at night, when battles are done and the music has softened, you might open the Pokédex just to scroll, listening to the faint blip as the cursor moves, watching each weak, blocky sprite appear for a second before fading into the next. This is not a story of glory or victory. It is a slow ritual, a way to wander through Kanto without taking a single step. Imagine them drifting in the current, not just the water types, but every entry, from Rattata to Mew, floating past as you grow sleepier, the numbers ticking upward like a gentle metronome. And yet, beyond this encyclopedia, and beyond Oak's quiet request, the real measure of your team waits far away, then at the Pokémon League above Indigo Plateau, where all that recorded knowledge will finally be tested. So now the Pokédex is full of neat little numbers, and Oak is satisfied. But the game gently points you somewhere numbers can't help, up through Victory Road and into the thin air of Indigo Plateau, where the wind seems to quiet down just so you can hear that new solemn music. It's slower, more deliberate than the routes below, almost like the game is telling you to settle in, close your eyes, and notice that this is not a story of glory or victory, so much as a test of how calmly you can endure. The building itself feels strangely plain, just a big block of light and shadow on the Game Boy screen. And yet, as soon as you step inside, there's that sense that the doors behind you might as well be locked. For every carefree Pokemart clerk and polite Nurse Joy standing here, there is the unspoken rule that once you walk past that first chamber door, you are no longer a traveler. You are a challenger, and the game will not let you run back to town if things go wrong. The league isn't loud, it's quietly stern. What makes Indigo Plateau so interesting is how it divides that pressure into 4 distinct rooms, 4 different kinds of worry. Lorelei waits first with her ice and water types, a line of Dugong, Cloyster, Slowbro, Jinx, and Lapras that looks gentle on the surface, almost sleepy, but hides thick defenses and that frustrating tendency to freeze or confuse you when you're just trying to land a hit. Then Bruno follows, all muscles and rockin' fighting Pokemon, Onix somehow still weak despite its size, Hitmonchan and Hitmonlee punching at your team's softer spots. Agatha arrives like a grumpy grandmother of ghosts, her Gengar and Haunter and their poison tricks punishing trainers who never bothered to understand status moves. And then Lance closes the set with his dragons that aren't quite dragons. 2 Dragonair and a Dragonite, surrounded by Gyarados and Aerodactyl. A reminder that in red, even the mighty Dragon type is stitched together from whatever the cartridge could manage. Placed together, these 4 are less a gauntlet of raw power and more a checklist of everything you did or didn't prepare for on the way up. You can't heal at a Pokemon Center between them, of course. You only have the items you carried in, the full restores and revives you hopefully bought before stepping through the first door. Each battle leaves a little residue of damage. A missing PP here, a fainted creature there, and you start to ration your moves like a traveler counting the last drops of water. Between rooms, the screen fades to black, then back in, and those short hallways become tiny, wordless intermissions where you walk alone and listen to your own doubts. Imagine them drifting in the current, not weak water Pokemon this time, but your tired team members, swirling around you in that dark fade as you decide who leads next, who needs one more potion, who will have to go in half-healed and hope. After Lance's fierce, almost theatrical battle, the music shifts again, softer but not quite triumphant, and the game lets you breathe as if everything is finished. And yet, down one last corridor, in a room where you thought your name would already be engraved, someone else is standing in your place, waiting. And the real final test of Indigo Plateau is only just beginning. So you step forward, expecting ceremony, and instead you get a familiar face, a name you've seen in menus and battle screens since the very first route, now standing exactly where you thought you would be. Your rival is not just another strong trainer now. He has already been crowned champion, and the final room of Indigo Plateau quietly becomes something different, a personal confrontation wrapped in those same small Game Boy pixels. It's a gentle kind of shock, the sort that doesn't shout, just rearranges the air in the room. For every gym leader with a title and a theme, there is this one boy who simply arrived a little earlier, beat the same Elite Four you did, and claimed the position you were walking toward. The game doesn't pause to explain, doesn't offer a cutscene. It just lets you read his dialogue and feel that small, frustrating twist that your journey, which felt unique, has always had a shadow running just ahead. What makes this encounter so interesting is how his team feels like a mirror held up to your whole adventure. He leads with things you've seen on routes and in caves, familiar creatures that have grown alongside you. But now they're fully evolved, tuned to exploit the weaknesses you've learned to fear. His starter, the one he chose to counter yours back in Professor Oak's lab, has reached its final form, a kind of quiet thesis statement about type advantage and planning, standing there as a fully realized answer to your own choice. If you picked Charmander and struggled through Brock and Misty, he stands with Blastoise, a heavy, calm tank of a water Pokémon that seems built to smother fire. If you chose Bulbasaur, he answers with Charizard, suddenly fast and dramatic, turning your early game comfort into a late game threat. And if you went with Squirtle, he brings out Venusaur, a slow, looming creature that can feel almost helpless in other hands, yet here methodically drains and poisons, as if the game is reminding you that even gentle grass types can close in when given the right support. The music rises for this battle, using the same small palette of 8-bit sounds that has followed every important fight. But the tempo and layering are just a little sharper, a little more insistent. It's not loud in a modern sense. This is not a story of glory or victory blasted through speakers, just a slightly more intense pattern of familiar notes, enough to make your heart tap along while the sprites trade blows and health bars slide down. When you finally win, the release is quiet but unmistakable. The screen flashes white, the battle music drops away, and your rival's overworld sprite seems smaller as the dialogue shifts from arrogance to something softer. That almost childlike disappointment of a trainer who tried to be strong and simply lost. Then the champion theme gives way to Professor Oak's arrival, and the tone changes again, not to celebration exactly, but to recognition. Placed together, these tiny moments of flicker, sound, and text form a kind of lullaby for the end of your journey. Oak walks you down the corridor to the Hall of Fame. The lights dim a little, and your team is recorded one by one. Those weak early catches and late-game powerhouses frozen side by side. The credits roll over simple visuals and steady music. And even here, if you settle in, close your eyes, it feels calm and understated, as if Kanto itself is winding down for the night and inviting you to drift with it. And yet, once the last name fades and you return to the title screen, the file is still there, the world's still waiting, and the game has one more quiet secret. Becoming champion is not an ending so much as a soft pause, a moment to breathe before you start wandering again, back onto routes you thought you knew, where tiny, overlooked details are still hiding in the grass. So the file waits, the tall grass waits, and somewhere just off-screen, your tired team is waiting too, which is why the Hall of Fame room feels less like a throne room and more like a quiet back hallway where the game takes you aside and says, very softly, "Let's remember who got you here." You step onto that little platform. The lights dim in a way only a Game Boy screen can manage, and suddenly the professor is there, not to lecture, but to record. One by one, your Pokémon slide onto the screen, each sprite framed for a brief, flickering moment. Each nickname pulled into focus as if the cartridge itself respects your questionable naming conventions. A battered Pidgeot with a silly name, an underleveled Paras that never quite kept up, maybe a Goldeen that never evolved because you forgot, all treated with the same ceremony as a perfectly raised starter. This is not a story of glory or victory shouted from rooftops. It is a tiny roll call for the weak and the weary, who still showed up to every battle. What makes this so interesting is how quietly it validates your choices. The game never scolds you for dragging that helpless Magikarp all the way to the league, or for leaning on a dugong that is, frankly, a little underwhelming compared to the bulkier waters you could have trained. For every optimized, carefully planned champion team, there is a half-accidental party of creatures caught on a whim, over-leveled in some places, and frustratingly fragile in others. And the Hall of Fame places them together, these misfits and overachievers, under a single, dignified heading. Then the screen cuts to black, and the credits begin to drift upward. White text on a dark void, like names rising through deep water. The music is simple, a looping lullaby more than a fanfare, and most trainers never read every name, but they feel them. A slow tide of unfamiliar syllables that hints at the people behind the pixels. Settle in, close your eyes, and you can almost hear the cartridge exhale as it lists programmers, designers, and that familiar Game Freak tag. Each line appearing and vanishing with the same steady rhythm. Finishing Pokémon Red late at night, when your room is dark and the Game Boy screen is the only light, turns this into a strangely intimate moment. Your team has stopped moving. The battles are over, and yet your thumb still hovers near the buttons, half expecting another rival, another route, another stubborn Onix that refuses to faint. Imagine them drifting in the current. Your tired starter, a few fainted backups, a box full of forgotten water types you never quite trained, all suspended in that pause between the last note of the credits music and the soft return to the title screen. And when that title screen returns, blinking and familiar, many players do something very simple. They start again. Maybe they reset the file. Maybe they just wander back through Kanto as champion, revisiting caves, surfing past the same weak tentacool that once annoyed them, tracing old paths until the journey feels like a loop instead of a line. The Hall of Fame and credits pretend to be an ending, but really they are a gentle suggestion. There are still routes to walk, still secrets tucked into corners, and still one more quiet story waiting if you press A. So after the credits fade, and that suggestion to keep going lingers on the screen, the game quietly offers something simple. More paths to walk, more grass to rustle through, more familiar little loops for your mind to trace as you settle in. Close your eyes and let Kanto repeat itself. For every dramatic gym battle or tense rival encounter, there is a stretch of route that feels like returning to the same soft dream. Route 1 is the first of these, a tiny strip of land between Pallet Town and Viridian City. And yet, it sets the pattern for almost everything that follows. Short ledges, a few patches of grass, and those first weak creatures, Pidgey and Rattata, waiting to interrupt you with their squeaky, almost apologetic cries. The encounter table here is gentle and narrow, as if the game is whispering, "This is what wild battles feel like," without overwhelming you. You see no trainers, no real danger, just the rhythm of step, step, encounter, and that looping early game music. Then, much later, Route 3 stretches out beyond Pewter, like Route 1's older sibling, a little taller, a little meaner, but still recognizably part of the same family. Now there are trainers lined up along the path, bug catchers, and last sprites placed, so their sight lines create tiny puzzles. Do you walk straight into their gaze, or slip around the edge and come back later? What makes Route 3 so interesting is how it layers new Pokémon, Spearow, Nidoran, the first hints of more exotic species, on top of that same basic structure of grass and dirt and item balls tucked just off the main road. By the time you reach Route 8, threading your way between Saffron and Lavender, the pattern is fully formed and quietly comforting. There are rows of trainers standing in formation, like a gauntlet that has been run 100 times before, and the encounter table starts to repeat older faces while sprinkling in new ones, so that Meowth or Growlithe arrive alongside the ever-present Pidgeline, like guests added to an old familiar party. And yet, nothing here is truly surprising. The trainers' sightlines are fixed, their teams unchanging, their challenges small enough that even a tired player can drift through them. Placed together, these routes become less like separate locations and more like recurring dreams. Each playthrough shuffles the details. Maybe you catch a different Pokémon in the grass. Maybe a critical hit turns a battle. But the broad strokes remain the same, and your hands almost move on their own. Step around that youngster. Cut through that patch of grass. Pick up that item ball you already know contains something modest and slightly frustrating, like a potion you no longer need. Pattern interrupt. Imagine, just for a moment, for replaying these stretches with the sound off. The routes would still work, still repeat, but they would lose something essential, because beyond the routes and battles, it's the soundscape, the looping route themes, the soft chime of picking up an item, the compressed cries of each small creature, that turns these paths into lullabies. As Kanto's roads repeat, the music repeats with them, and the next quiet story waiting is not about where you walk, but about what you hear while you do. So as the paths loop and the footsteps blur, the next thing that rises up isn't another tall patch of grass, but that gentle, slightly tinny hum from inside the Game Boy itself. 4 fragile sound channels working as hard as they can. Settle in, close your eyes for a moment, and imagine that tiny gray brick as a kind of music box, where every track in Pokémon Red has to squeeze through 2 simple pulse waves, 1 scratchy noise channel, and a humble little sample lane pretending to be a drum. What makes this so interesting is how weak that hardware really is on paper, and yet, how strong the memories feel. Composers like Junichi Masuda had only those 2 melodic voices to carry every route theme, every gym battle, every lull between encounters. So each line has to do double duty, melody and rhythm weaving around one another, rarely wasting a note. For every booming orchestral remake you've heard since, there is that original, bare-bones version, just square waves in imagination, somehow enough to suggest whole oceans, cities, and silent forests. The Pokémon themselves don't get much more luxury. Each creature's cry in red is just a tiny bit of data, more like a digital squeak than a roar. So many of them share the same bass sound, nudged up or down in pitch, stretched or clipped. Rattata and Poliwag, Machop and Geodude. Placed together, these pairs are built from the same little template. Yet over time, trainers start to hear them as completely different voices. A short chirp becomes a proud declaration. A warbling buzz becomes a dopey complaint. And the poor, weak ones sound almost apologetic as they appear and then faint in a single hit. Listen to Pallet Town's theme, that slow, rocking pattern that never really goes anywhere, just sways. It feels like water in a glass, barely disturbed, perfect for standing outside your house and doing nothing in particular. Then the route themes begin to pick up. Still simple, still looping, but with a gentle sense of forward motion, like a weak little current tugging you along even when your team is underleveled and every battle feels a bit helpless and frustrating. Gym battles, by contrast, sound almost stern, those sharp pulses snapping in time, the noise channel hissing like a crowd you can't quite hear. Lavender Town turns the same ingredients into something sadder, minor notes bending in and out. A slow, uneasy pattern that lingers long after you leave the Pokémon Tower. This is not a story of glory or victory. It's a story of repetition, of hearing the same few bars through small plastic speakers at midnight, or through cheap headphones while you hide under a blanket, so no one knows you're still awake. Imagine them drifting in the current. The cries, the motifs, the little jingles for level-ups and item pickups, all looping softly while you grind weak creatures on Route 1 or stare at the PC box a bit too long. Over time, that soundscape becomes a kind of white noise, a comfort blanket for tired trainers, even when the Game Boy's volume is turned almost all the way down. And yet, beyond those notes and pixels, something else was quietly reshaped before the game ever reached Western hands. Because the words you read on that tiny screen, the names, the jokes, the strange little phrases, are not quite the same as they were in Japan. And the next quiet story is about how those translated lines changed Kanto without anyone really noticing. So if the music was softened and the pixels were simple, the language itself was quietly sanded down too, long before most trainers ever picked up a Game Boy. Settle in, close your eyes, and picture that odd split. In Japan, children met Pokémon Red and Green, while in the West, the same adventure arrived as Red and Blue, already touched up, already adjusted, like a familiar story retold with slightly different words. The most obvious shift lived in the sprites, those tiny portraits that gave each creature its first impression. In Japanese Red and Green, some designs were rough, almost like sketchbook doodles that had escaped onto the cartridge. Gengar with a wider, stranger grin. Mew looking more like a wiry laboratory specimen than a mythical prize. And a few early monsters with poses that were more monstrous than cute. For every fierce, polished Charizard you remember from Western Red and Blue, there is a slightly lumpy, off-model cousin lurking in the Japanese versions, all jagged outlines and awkward angles. When the games crossed the ocean, many of those sprites were redrawn, smoothing faces, rounding bodies, and making certain Pokémon look softer, cuter, a little less threatening. Clefairy's proportions were tidied, Pikachu's shape nudged towards something more plush and marketable, and even the ghostly line in Lavender Town looked a touch more defined and less like a glitch that had learned to walk. What makes this so interesting is how those tiny edits changed the tone. Kanto became less like a world of strange cryptids and more like a toy box of approachable companions. The words followed the same path. Move names and item names were reshaped to fit Western ears. Puns that relied on Japanese wordplay were swapped out for new jokes, new rhythms, new little winks that local players would actually understand. A simple potion stayed a potion, but attacks like Karate Chop and Thunderbolt were chosen not just for accuracy, but for how they sounded in the moment, right before a battle message scrolled by. Some NPC lines lost direct cultural references, others gained a bit of extra flavor, and a few oddball jokes simply vanished, leaving behind a smoother, more neutral script that was easier to drift through while half awake. And yet, tucked between those gentler sprites and tidier sentences, the programmers also slipped in quiet adjustments to the game's structure. Certain bugs from Red and Green were fixed, a few move-learn sets were altered, and balance tweaks nudged especially weak or frustrating spots just enough that new trainers wouldn't feel completely helpless. It was never a total overhaul. This is not a story of glory or victory over difficulty, just a soft sanding of sharp corners, so the same journey could be walked by more people, in more places. Placed together, these changes, redrawn faces, renamed attacks, repaired glitches, might sound like they would fracture the memory of Kanto, but they didn't. The feeling of a small, self-contained adventure, a loop of routes and towns you can circle in your mind when you can't sleep, stayed intact in every region. Imagine them drifting in the current. The Japanese sprites, the Western text, the shared map and music, all versions of the same quiet place. As we move on, those layers of design, music, text, and myth will keep stacking until Pokémon Red feels less like a cartridge and more like a single, cohesive memory you can return to whenever the real world feels a little too loud. So from that single shared memory, the scene can soften and narrow until it's just you and that first tiny town again. Settle in, close your eyes, and picture Pallet Town. Not as pixels on a Game Boy screen, but as a quiet little diorama that only lights up when you think about it. The water at the edge, gently looping in that simple animation. It has been repeating since 1996. There's no menu open, no objective flashing. This is not a story of glory or victory. You're just standing by your house, the music humming in the background. That slightly off-key comfort you could recognize from the first note. And the tall grass of Route 1 is waiting, not to frustrate you with weak encounters, but simply to rustle when you step close. You move forward, and you can almost hear the faint hiss of the Game Boy speaker before the encounter chime plays in your memory, even if no creature actually appears. Route 1 in this version is unoccupied. The Pidgey and Rattata that once felt like helpless obstacles have the night off. For every frantic early game grind, there is this slower walk, where the ledges are not annoying shortcuts, but familiar bumps in the path, and the potion from the helpful clerk is already safely tucked away in your bag. What makes this stretch so interesting is how little really happens here. And yet, how many trainers remember every tile? You drift through Viridian City at the same unhurried pace. The Mart clerk doesn't need you to deliver anything. The old man isn't blocking the road with a long tutorial about catching weak Pokémon. And the gym at the top of town is just an unmarked building that doesn't demand a battle. The fountain sits still, the water frozen in that single looping frame, as if the whole place politely waits until you decide to press A. Up past the forest, Pewter City feels smaller than you remember, the rocky palette washed in gentle grays. Brock isn't here to test your team or punish your poor Charmander. The gym door might as well be locked for the night. The museum lights are dim, the fossils resting quietly, and you're free to stroll past without thinking about type matchups or how your Squirtle effortlessly trivialized this part of the game. Cerulean City follows, its bright blue water now more like a calm pond than a battlefield. The Nugget Bridge trainers have gone home, the rival has nothing rude to say, and even Misty's Starmie, usually so eager to show off its power, is off somewhere spinning in the dark like a forgotten prop. Imagine them drifting in the current. All those once threatening teams reduced to soft background shapes, their sharp moves rounded off by time. Walking like this, you can almost feel your old team beside you, even though the game never let them follow. A Charizard's wings that will never fit on the screen, a Gyarados coiled along the shore, a tiny Butterfree keeping pace just above your shoulder. Placed together, these invisible companions fill the empty routes without asking for battles or experience. There's nothing urgent to do, no badges to win, no Elite Four waiting impatiently at the end of the map. Kanto is content to idle in the dark, ready whenever you return, whether you're wide awake or drifting off. And as this quiet walk begins to circle back toward the heart of the region, there are still a few last clusters of facts ahead. Small, almost hidden design choices, that even veteran trainers might have stepped over without ever noticing. Those small, almost hidden design choices aren't just in the layout of caves or the way a route bends. They're also buried deep inside the numbers, in tiny systems that most trainers never saw and only felt, like a faint current under the surface of the water. Settle in, close your eyes, and imagine Pokémon Red. Not as a simple cartridge, but as a quiet machine of dice rolls and secret values, quietly deciding whether a creature stays with you or slips away. Every time a Pokeball shakes, there is a secret conversation happening between the game and that wild Pokémon. Now, each species in Red has a hidden catch rate, a single number tucked away, saying how willing it is to be caught. A Caterpie, with its generous value, almost seems to give up immediately, while something like a legendary bird resists with a stubborn, frustrating patience. The lower its HP, the better your odds, and if it's asleep or paralyzed, the invisible math leans a little further in your favor. Yet, even then, the ball can still crack open and send that weak creature fleeing, as if the game is reminding you that nothing here is guaranteed. What makes this so interesting is how it feels from the outside. You just see one shake, two shakes, and then the sudden click, or the sudden escape, and you build stories in your head about luck, about certain balls working better, about pressing A at the right time. For every careful strategy, there is a superstition, and together, they blur into that childhood belief that some Pokémon simply don't want to be caught, even though it was always numbers humming away behind the screen. The battles themselves hide another quiet trick. In Generation 1, critical hits are tied to speed, so the faster a Pokémon is, the more often it lands those sharp, surprising blows. A frail Rattata, or a quick Persian darting across the field, suddenly feels far more dangerous than its stats suggest, while a slow, sturdy creature just plods along, rarely landing that dramatic strike. This is not a story of glory or victory. It's a story of quick little ambushes, of fast Pokémon punching above their weight because the formula quietly favors them. Even the AI has its quirks. Many trainers in Red never switch out, even when they are helpless against your type advantage, stubbornly spamming a weak move as if they don't quite understand the battle they're in. Some favor specific attacks over and over, like a confused habit they can't break, turning what should be a fearsome encounter into something almost comedic, almost sad. Placed together, these hidden systems explain why some fights felt oddly hard and others strangely gentle, why one gym battle melted away and another lingered in your memory for years. And yet, most players never learned the formulas. They just carried the feelings. As this quiet tangle of mechanics fades into the background, the last stretch of our journey drifts back toward memory, emotion, and the simple act of replaying Pokémon Red just to feel that world again, as if you could walk those routes forever. So the numbers and hidden formulas sink beneath the surface again, and what rises instead is something softer. The way you kept coming back. You finish the league, you watch the credits crawl up that tiny screen, and then, weeks or months later, you hover over the continue option and feel that strange, quiet itch to start over, as if the whole of Kanto is calling from behind a pane of glass. To answer that call, you have to do something a little cruel. You move the cursor down to New Game, and the warning appears, blunt and unemotional, promising that your adventure will overwrite the old one. This is not a story of glory or victory. It's a story of pressing A anyway, of erasing a level 78 Charizard, a tired Lapra that ferried you across every stretch of water, a Pidgeot that has seen more Route 1 Rattata than any creature should. And there is a small pang, almost like deleting a photograph. And yet, your finger doesn't hesitate for long. What makes this so interesting is how quickly the helpless beginning replaces the powerful ending. One moment you command a full team with perfect coverage. The next you are a child again, facing that first wild Pidgey with only a scratch attack and no potions. For every champion team that could steamroll any battle, there is that brand new Bulbasaur squaring up against Brock with clumsy vine whips, or that weak Squirtle awkwardly chewing through Caterpie in Viridian Forest. Placed together, these runs blur into a single looping memory of Red that somehow never quite wears out. The cartridge, unfortunately, does. Inside that gray shell is a tiny battery, to quietly keeping time for your save file, even when the Game Boy is asleep in a drawer. Over the years, the charge fades. One day, the game boots, and the continue option is gone, as if your trainer never existed. From that moment on, every new journey is temporary by design. A sandcastle you build knowing the tide of hardware will eventually wash it away. Some trainers responded by replaying even more, almost defiantly. Childhood runs turned into teenage challenge runs, then into adult comfort runs, where you stroll through Kanto like revisiting an old neighborhood. You notice different details each time. The way the Pokédex order reflects development history more than lore. The odd, reused cries that make unrelated Pokémon sound like distant cousins. The absence of any day-night cycle freezing the world in an endless, gentle afternoon. Then the world shifted from cartridges to downloads. On the 3DS Virtual Console, Pokémon Red arrived again. Still the same simple game without time-based evolutions. Still the same awkward sprites and weak early game move pools, but now framed in a glowing modern screen. Later remakes like Fire Red and Leaf Green rebuilt Kanto with color, abilities, and new moves. Yet the skeleton stayed familiar. Pallet Town, Route 1, Viridian Forest. That first gym battle you could almost play in your sleep. Settle in, close your eyes, and imagine them drifting in the current. The original cart with its fading battery, the virtual console icon, the remake cartridge, all versions of the same quiet journey. As we move toward the end of this video, we'll start to gather these threads of design, memory, and myth, and follow them into one last reflection on what remains when the data is gone, the battery is dry, and only the story of Kanto is left floating in the dark. When people think back on Pokémon Red, they rarely remember polygons or particle effects. They remember a tiny screen glowing in the dark, the soft buzz of the Game Boy speaker, and that first title screen chime that somehow felt bigger than the plastic shell in their hands. It was simple, almost bare by modern standards, and yet that very weakness in presentation is what makes it feel so strangely comforting now. The sprites are blocky, the colors limited, the cries reused and pitched up or down to squeeze more creatures into less space. But this sparseness leaves wide open spaces in the mind. For every rigid Charizard sprite, there is the version that lived only in a child's imagination. Wings spread wider, fire burning hotter, standing triumphantly in a battle that the Game Boy could never actually show. What makes Red so interesting is that its rough edges quietly invite trainers to smooth them over, to fill in missing details, to decide for themselves how fierce a Rattata looks or how gentle Lapras really is. The music works the same way. A handful of looping tracks, a few beeps for menus, the soft click of the Pokédex. It is limited, but that limitation turns each route theme into a kind of lullaby. Viridian Forest's simple pattern becomes mystery, Lavender Town's high notes become unease, and the Pokémon Center theme becomes safety. Placed together, these tiny sounds form a soundscape that doesn't shout for attention. It just waits, patient and familiar, every time you press power. And unlike later adventures, there is no clock ticking in the corner, no day-night cycle shifting colors, no events that expire if you don't log in this week. Red does not care if it is 3 p.m. or 3 a.m. in your room. It will offer the same wild Pidgey on Route 1, the same stubborn Brock waiting with his rock types, the same helpless Magikarp flopping at level 5 if you buy it from that salesman. This is not a story of glory or victory that must be chased on a schedule. It is a self-contained cartridge, always frozen at the exact moment you last close the menu. Over time, the game and the player's own history fuse together so tightly that it becomes hard to tell where one ends and the other begins. The version of Red where you picked Charmander and suffered through Pewter Gym feels different from the one where you chose Squirtle and casually washed Brock away. The save file where you got stuck in Rock Tunnel without Flash, wandering in the dark, is a different Kanto from the one where you breezed through with a guide. And yet, they are all the same data. Your first trade, perhaps a lopsided swap of a proud Kadabra for a very confused Seal. Your first Link battle, lost to a crit you still insist was unfair, even the first time you saw Missing No, and half believed it might eat your save file. These memories cling to the roots like fog. The pacing of Red quietly supports this kind of gentle nostalgia. Early routes are short, the grass patches modest, and the difficulty spikes arrive with enough warning that, even when a gym wipes your team, it feels more like a nudge than a punishment. Some creatures are weak, others are simply strange, and a few, like that poor Goldeen with its peck and tail whip, are remembered less for their power and more for how little they bring to a battle. It is a world designed to be walked through slowly, to be repeated absent-mindedly, to be played in bed with the screen dimmed while the rest of the house is silent. Pattern interrupt. Imagine, just for a moment, loading that same save file decades later and realizing that nothing inside has aged at all. The rival still waits on Nugget Bridge. The Elite Four still stand in their identical rooms. The internal Pokédex still quietly orders creatures by development history instead of importance. Time moves on outside, but Red remains exactly as you left it, like a snow globe of Kanto resting on a shelf. As this video has wandered through glitches and gym leaders, starter choices and strange myths, it has been tracing that same slow, looping path that the game encourages. Settle in, close your eyes, and let the details begin to blur. The exact stats, the encounter tables, the hidden items tucked into corners of caves. Imagine them drifting in the current of memory, not demanding to be sorted or ranked, just floating. From here, we'll slip into one last reflection, a quiet look at what lingers after the pixels fade and the cartridge finally falls silent, when all that's left is the feeling of Kanto, waiting in the dark. So now, as those sharper details begin to blur, it helps to drift back to where everything started, where the screen was almost empty and the world felt impossibly large. Pallet Town, with its 2 houses, 1 lab, and a stretch of gentle water at the edge of the map, is hardly more than a few rectangles and a looping tune. And yet, this is where trainers first felt that quiet pull of possibility, that sense that beyond the ledge and the tall grass, something was waiting. Route 1 is barely a road, just a slope, dotted with Rattata and Pidgey, and maybe a potion hidden in the grass if you knew where to press A. But in memory, it becomes a kind of first test, the place where your very first starter choice suddenly feels real. Charmander, already at a type disadvantage and a little weak against what lies ahead. Bulbasaur, almost smug in how easily it handles the early gyms. Or Squirtle, sturdy and reliable, a small blue shell that quietly promises fewer frustrating losses in battle. For every child who picked based on power, there is another who simply liked the sprite. From there, the journey unwinds like a slow, familiar song. You can almost hear Ss Anne's horn again. That moment when the ship pulls away and you realize that this grand floating playground of trainers, items, and cramped little cabins is gone for good. Lavender Town waits further along, its music thin and echoing. A few repeated notes that somehow feel heavier than any orchestral score, turning simple ghost sprites into something that lingers long after the Game Boy light clicks off. And yet, the story is not only in the places the game clearly marks. It's in the rumors whispered on playgrounds about Mew under the truck by the harbor, in the first time someone's screen filled with scrambled pixels and a strange, seemed blocky creature called Missing No. In the quiet confusion of watching a Kadabra evolve into Alakazam mid-trade, and realizing that the link cable, this simple plastic rope between two systems, could change what your Pokémon even was. By the time the rival stands before you on the Indigo Plateau, his team fully evolved, his confidence still somehow a little paper thin, the whole region has folded in on itself. The Hall of Fame room is tiny, softly lit, almost bare, and this is not a story of glory or victory, shouted from the rooftops, but of names and sprites quietly recorded, then left alone. Placed together, these moments turn a small, limited cartridge, with no day-night cycle and no elaborate cutscenes, into an entire world of late-night play sessions, of whispered myths, of weak cries, and reused sound effects that still feel personal. So settle in, close your eyes, and let the specific facts drift away. What makes Kanto so interesting is how it stays with you, even when you can't recall each route in order. Only the feeling of walking through it one more time, half awake, while the screen slowly fades into the dark. So from here, you can let the details blur at the edges, like an old CRT glow fading after midnight, and instead picture one last simple ritual in that tiny 8-bit Kanto. You're not rushing to another battle now. This is not a story of glory or victory, just a quiet ending that every tired trainer knows by heart. Imagine your character stepping into the Pokémon Center, that familiar doorway you've walked through 100 times, the chime playing in your memory. Even if the real room around you is silent, the nurse leans forward with the same line she has spoken since 1996. A weak little text box promising full health, and the healing jingle rings out softly in your mind, each note slower and rounder than it ever sounded through the Game Boy speaker, as if the sound itself were getting sleepy. You move to the PC, to that simple save option, and even here there is something calming about the old menu, about the way the game politely asks if you're sure, as though it knows you're half awake. For every intense Elite Four rematch, there is this small moment of pressing A one last time, watching the words, "saving, don't turn off the power," appear, and feeling like the whole world inside that cartridge is taking a deep breath with you. Now, in your mind, the screen light softens. The Game Boy is a little heavier in your hands, or maybe it's just a shape you remember from years ago. Plastic edges worn and buttons slightly loose from all those frustrating encounters with weak creatures that never quite pulled their weight. You flick the switch or tap the button, and the screen fades to a pale gray, then to black, until Kanto disappears and the room around you quietly returns to darkness. And yet, the world doesn't vanish. It simply waits. All of Kanto is still tucked into that tiny cartridge, routes and cities and glitchy corners where time doesn't pass because there is no in-game clock, just data sleeping, perfectly still. Your favorite team is resting there too, each Pokémon sealed in its Pokeball, not fainted, not helpless, simply dozing between adventures, like they know their trainer will come back when the next gentle wave of nostalgia rolls in. You can settle in, close your eyes, and breathe slowly with them now. Inhale, as if you're drawing in the quiet surf of Route 19. Exhale, as if you're letting go of a long, tiring gym battle you no longer need to win. What makes Kanto so interesting is how it holds both the powerful and the disappointing side by side. Placed together, these strong champions and weak water oddities all fall asleep in the same save file, equal once the power is off. If your thoughts wander, you can always return here, to this video, to this slow walk through an old game that evolves only when you decide to press start again. There is no rush, no looming rival, only familiar music and small safe facts waiting in the dark. And if, when you wake, you feel like visiting Kanto one more time, you'll know exactly where to find it. For now, just let the sound drift out. Let your breathing match the steady rhythm of some forgotten route theme. And if you'd like more quiet journeys like this, you can remember to come back, to subscribe in your own time, and to let another gentle story carry you off to sleep when the day feels a little too long. So if, somewhere in the middle of all those tiny sprites and weak little creatures, you felt yourself drifting a bit, you might want to let this journey stay close by. You could, when you're fully awake again, tuck this into a sleep playlist or a quiet study corner, so that the next time the day feels heavy and you want to settle in, close your eyes and listen to something gentle. Kanto will be only a tap away instead of a whole search. There is no need to move now, of course. This is not a story of glory or victory, and it is not a story that demands quick reactions or perfect timing. For every intense, fast-paced battle video, there is something like this, slow and low pressure. Just a soft walk past the Pokémon Center in Viridian, past the weak Pidgey on Route 1, past the helpless Magikarp splashing in the background of your memory. If it helps, you can simply remember that the save button, the playlist, the like, they will all still be there tomorrow. What makes Kanto so interesting is that it lingers, even when the Game Boy is long gone and the cartridge is sitting in a drawer somewhere. And yet, the feelings stay close enough to touch. So, when you're rested, when you've had your sleep, and the light is back in the room, you might wander down to the comments and leave a small note about your calmest or most nostalgic Pokémon Red moment. Maybe the first time you reached Lavender Town and realized the music was more sad than scary. Or the time your underleveled Squirtle somehow won a battle it had no right to win. Placed together, these little memories become their own Pokédex of quiet stories. If you'd like this kind of gentle wandering through other regions, subscribing simply makes it easier to find the next sleepy journey, the next set of facts that barely raise their voice above a whisper. For every legendary water Pokémon that dominates a battle, there is a weak, slightly frustrating one that mostly exists to splash, stall, or faint. And there will be time to visit them all, one by one, without hurry. A subscribe now, or later, or not at all, just means that when another region calls, your map will already be marked. Most of all, remember that there is no obligation here. This space is meant to stay low pressure, cozy, and always here when you need it. The way Pallet Town is always waiting at the bottom of the map, unchanged, no matter how many times a trainer defeats the Elite Four. You can come back for the facts, or for the music in your head, or simply for the feeling of walking through tall grass that never really fights back. So for now, imagine them drifting in the current, the roots of Kanto, frozen in 8-bit stillness. Every wild encounter paused mid-step. Every weak Rattata and fragile Caterpie waiting politely off-screen. Somewhere, the title screen of Pokémon Red is holding its breath, the cursor resting on Continue, ready for the next time you press Start or press Play and let this quiet little world unfold around you again.